Row. Can everybody please move down? And if you don't move down, we'll hassle you for not having moved down. Get close. We're in this together. We're collaborating. The first sign of collaboration is to be with your co-collaborator. So will the people in the back row please move down? Oh, I'm going to start right. Always try. You're waiting on one person, but now we're complete. We're going to start right now.
Okay, give me about 60 seconds.
60 seconds. Okay. To move down. You people, and we know who you are, who is sitting in the back, we're asking nicely, we'll be asking again and again, yes, you too, Henry. In fact, be a leader, show some leadership and move down. And if you're not a leader, be a follower. Show some followership and move down. Let's get together on this. It's a spiritual thing, a conceptual thing. You too, Lance. We're not letting you go on this, Lance. You have to come down. Lance. It's Lance Tanaka. Lance. You, Lance. You have to, no, further, ladies. It's not good enough. No. That's not a sign of excellence or leadership. You got to move down. More, Lance, more. Well, I wish I could say I am impressed with how far you moved down. It's a bit of a struggle. Sir, can't you move down? It's a mental thing. It's a state of mind thing. It's a willingness to participate at the core. It's a sign of respect to our speakers, panelists, and presenters. Thank you, Henry. Perfectly done. Okay, I guess I'm happy except for the person in that row over there. Sharon is now signaling. Yeah. No, I'm going to make something of this. I'm sorry. In time, you will learn to forgive me for my insistence. There's somebody back there, sir. Are you here for flight 578 or? Okay, thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for joining us at the center of the Energy Policy Forum's Legislative Briefing 2018. So let me say aloha, Happy New Year. Welcome to the 14th Annual Energy Briefing sponsored by the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. Of course, you already know that this is the 10th anniversary of the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative in our state, celebrated, just yesterday at Washington Place, if you weren't there. It's the perfect time to take stock of where we've been, how we've done, what we set as goals in recent years, and how we should plan, that's the operative word, to achieve them. So 10 years after the HCEI began, we still have to roll up our sleeves, and we should not just rest on our laurels. So this year, we've partnered with our co-sponsor this time, the State Office of Planning, to look at how the state and the counties are addressing and planning for climate change projects, which are getting more severe on our vulnerable island state, increasingly vulnerable to increasing extreme weather. Clean energy, of course, is a significant part of that effort. So our 45-member forum represents a whole wide array of people: government, federal, state and local, academia, utilities, oil and gas companies, labor, renewable energy, trade associations, and environmental organizations. We meet every October as a forum of members to plan forward. At the center of our discussion this past year were the need for a comprehensive strategy to address critical infrastructure, the need to update the state's comprehensive long-range plan, again, the focus on plan, the Hawaii State Plan, the need to measure, manage, and improve the efficiency of our electrical grids, and notice that's plural, and the need for a comprehensive study of energy supply, demand, and export as we approach our clean energy goal. All these are big picture, complex, and expensive items. We need to address them now, particularly in a state which has, well, I say, fiscal restraints that'll probably increase going forward. Today, we sought state and county leaders and thinkers to come to the table here on what we are going to address and plan to prevent, adapt, and mitigate climate change impacts and the shocks and stressors, you'll hear more of those words later, that threaten our sustainability. You'll hear more about these things all through the afternoon. So today we want to advise and inform the legislature, the major policymakers on whose shoulders rest the decisions on policies and funding that will keep us all safe, save Hawaii, and safe and healthy and sustainable, and the public, on what attention needs to be given to focus in this session just starting next week. There's a lot going on here at the Capitol with conflicting briefings and meetings today. We've had to juggle the Office of Planning and DBED and the Hawaii State Energy Office presentations so our presenters can get to their WHAM budget briefing, and we greatly appreciate that they made the effort to be with us. We have legislators here today, either directly or by the remote system in the Capitol. We're going to talk about, they care about, and we're going to talk about the major drivers of the state, its economy, its energy, natural resources, environmental and agricultural natural resources, as well as our man-made resources, such as transportation. We need to coordinate and collaborate, all of those things, if we are to continue to enjoy our special quality of life in these islands. The most important message of the day is that we are asking policymakers and administrators to make good plans that reflect thoughtful policy and budget decision-making and good priorities so that the laws and budgets we adopt here in this building will address and satisfy the long-term needs of our state. We can ask for nothing less. We know there are many competing interests involved, so we want to ask one fundamental question. What do we need to do to get where we want to go, to survive the shocks and stressors we've been seeing and which we will see much more? The dreadful and destructive impacts of climate change on Hawaii. We want to know the plans of the major agencies in the state and the counties in that regard, what they have done, what they're planning to do, and if there are challenges, and I'm sure there are, how they plan to address them. We hope that the outcome of this briefing and its impact to the people who it reaches will clarify and prioritize the actions needed to get things actually done this year in 2018, an election year. The theme of the briefing last year focused on finding continuity. We looked there at 6 initiatives that were once hot, but not hot anymore. We inquired into what happened to them. Some were in process, others had been lost on the back shelf. And that brings us to our theme now, this year, in this briefing. And our theme, as you know, is making good plans, plans that work, plans that will ensure action, and a resilient, sustainable Hawaii. Good plans should guide actions, including actions that allocate resources like staff, like money. Good plans need to include thoughtful systems by which we can evaluate our performance every year, metrics. Are our plans capable of being translated into action, or do they need to be adjusted or thrown overboard and replaced? However good they are, is the public being properly informed? None of this is easy, but all of it is important. If we don't make plans with good and relentless follow-up, we may be frittering away our precious money and resources, or worse, risking our community and our society. So we asked the state and the counties to tell us about the plans they have to protect and save us from the shocks and stressors, the hurricanes, the tsunamis, the eroding coastline, the aging infrastructure. The stakes are high. How do we minimize the risk? How do we bounce back when a disaster strikes? Because it will. All this is the subject of discussion by the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Commission, which was established by the legislature last year, and a similar commission in Honolulu, the city and county of Honolulu, as well as other agencies in other counties. We have dreamed the dream of 100% renewable energy for these 10 years, renewable energy for all and for all of our state. Now we are on the threshold of community solar. That's a big step, a big win. We saw the need for sustainable transportation, and recently all 4 mayors signed an agreement to meet 100% sustainable ground transportation goal. That's great. But setting a goal is one thing, getting there is much harder. We need plans, good plans. It's 2018, what do we need to do now? Our speakers will tell us about their efforts, their revelations and concerns in the past they hope to follow. Collaboration and sharing are our friends. Distraction and delay and confusion are our enemies. We have to think into the future, round the corner. Short-term thinking, kicking the can is downright dangerous. What should the legislature do this year? It's risky business both ways. It's not only an election year, it's an El Nino year. You'll hear about that. An intersection this year of unavoidable risks. Today we have 3 panels. A panel of keynotes to lay the foundation for us. A panel of state agencies to tell us what's going on in the state and should go on. And a panel of county agencies to tell us what's going on in the counties and among the counties. It's great to see them all here, coming together on these problems, sharing them now with the legislature. After each of the panel presentations, we will have time for discussion and a few questions. So if you fill out the index cards that have been distributed, our staff will collect them and bring them to us, and we'll read them. In the past, and as in the past, we've asked Brigadier Stan Osserman, the fellow in the referee shirt, and the host of Stan the Energy Man on Think Tech Hawaii. He's going to be, as before, our trusty timekeeper. Thank you, as always, Stan. Okay, the keynote panel is first. We asked UH Law School Associate Dean Denise Antolini to lay the foundation why we are focusing on climate change, sustainability, and not solely on energy. And trying hard to bring energy and other issues together, we've asked her to look at how we can develop sound policies and plans that are feasible and will lead to action. We also asked her as a law professor to discuss the state of the law on these things in Hawaii and give us an idea about the legal issues most pressing and the legislation that will be most helpful to implement good plans. A tall order, but certainly no problem for Professor Antolini. A warm welcome for Denise Antolini.
Thank you, Jay. Yeah, can you hear? Is it loud enough?
Doesn't sound loud enough to me.
Loud enough that I can.
Okay. At Capital TV here, can you control the sound? It sounds like somebody.
Okay.
That's better. Yeah, good.
Push the button, I think, down. Thank you, Jay, very much, and thank you very much to all the sponsors of today's event, and Sharon in particular, and Mike. It's great to be here and to be with all of you. I will not probably successfully fulfill that tall order, but I'll do my best, Jay.
Sorry.
So I'm going to tell you a little story, and then also ask for a little bit of your participation. Talk about a case study, and then try to present some solutions that move us forward, as Jay has asked us to do. So how many of you have read John McPhee's The Control of Nature? Oh dear. High school, college, Spark Notes. So there's a passage I want to read you. So he wrote this in 1989. It's really a wonderful read. Short passage. In April of 1942, with Hawaii blacked out and Japanese carriers at large on the ocean, Mauna Loa erupted again. The lava river flowed so fast it included standing waves. Once again, the direction of flow was toward Hilo. The eruption was a military secret. People spoke of it in whispers, lest it serve as a beacon to the Japanese. This time, the planes were B-18, Bolo bombers. Their target was a natural levee hardened at the edge of the open flow. The bombs breached it. The lava spilled sideways, ran alongside the original stream, and rejoined it a distance below. It should be mentioned that these historic efforts to do battle with lava in Hawaii were few in number, futile in nature, and not conceived by Hawaiians. They were products to some extent of a mainland-educated scientific mind, and to a much greater extent of West Point, educated military minds. Hawaiians had lived with eruptions throughout Hawaiian history. And then he talks about Pele. So that's a little bit of a setting to give you a sense of a certain philosophy that I think we need to respond to. So what's the response? I'm going to jump right to it, and I'm not going to cover all the legal structure of everything, but I'm going to jump right to it, which is something called nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions has been around for a while, but it really erupted on the scene as a concept in 2009 in the UN FCCC, the Climate Change Framework Convention. And nature-based solutions had fresh life here in Hawaii when the World Conservation Congress, or the IUCN, met here in September. So now I want to see how many of you attended World Conservation Congress. Okay, it was fantastic, and now we have 10,000 new best friends around the world. Nature-based solutions was introduced in two resolutions, Resolution 62 and 77. So let me give you a sense of what that means. It is defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And one of the very important principles that it's based on is that it's site-specific, and it depends upon the cultural context and traditional, local, and scientific knowledge. And there's more, but all of the principles embedded in nature-based solutions are perfectly suited to us here in the islands and in the Pacific. So I want you to think about that concept, and in my limited time, I'm going to move on to a little case study. So I'm very fortunate to live on the North Shore in Pupukea, which I love. And I know all of you, how many of you have driven to the North Shore? You better all raise your hands. How many of you have been stuck in traffic? Okay, and in particular, you probably know Laniakea Beach as, I won't say the other name because it's not the fault of the turtles. Laniakea Beach is a particular bottleneck that's been of concern to the community for a long time. And it's become a source of great anxiety, consternation, and frustration. So Laniakea is a really good case study about how we can bring policy-based solutions that are nature-based to solve what is a worsening problem. You know, it's not just the North Shore that's eroding, it's true throughout the Hawaiian Islands. And it's right along our coastal artery highways that we need for a number of reasons just to survive. So there's been, I have to say, from a community perspective, plenty of talk, some planning, but not enough action. The community is quite anxious. And over the years, this legislature has tried to address the issue, but has never fully succeeded. There were bills that I was actually involved in back in 2014 to create a wayside park at Laniakea and move the highway Mauka, and to do something that allows the beach to retreat in a natural way. Soft measures rather than hardening of the coastline. That died. And there was also, we introduced a North Shore beach management plan, which died in conference. And that would have addressed the coastal erosion problem, working with Sea Grant and OCCL at DLNR. Some of those have been reintroduced, and recently, thanks to our really wonderful representatives and senators from the North Shore over the years, recently $15 million has been allocated to DOT to work again on Laniakea. But it's been going on for way too long. So, how do we address those kinds of issues involving climate change, coastal retreat, adaptation, and My pitch is that it's way past the time to plan, we have to act. And the way we should act, it should be based on the principle of nature-based solutions. So I propose, I suggest that DLNR, DOT, Office of Planning, all of our friends who are working on these issues, if they have nature-based solutions, the legislature should double the budgets for those projects, because in the long run, that investment is cheap. If instead we continue with investments of hardening our infrastructure, I'll be a little controversial, investing in cable and big wind instead of community solar, investing in bulldozers and hardening our coastlines, or no parking signs or concrete barriers, those are just short-term fixes. They're not in sync with our values here in Hawaii or with what nature is telling us. So I'm going to conclude by saying Hawaii has a unique opportunity. This is our zone. This is our lane. We can do it. We have the resources, the local knowledge. We also have an incredible ability to experiment and to have these experiments replicated beyond the landscape level. So I suggest that the way to move forward is to really invest in some landscape-specific action plans that are nature-based solutions to our adaptation and energy-related issues. In the long run, it's not only more effective, but it's also pono, and we're running out of time. I think everybody here would agree that our time frame, it's no longer linear, it's exponentially, whatever the word is, our time is evaporating so incredibly fast. So we need to invest, this legislature needs to invest deeply, and I would say double, in any solution to climate challenges, energy challenges that involve nature-based solutions. So that's my top of the lineup provocative introduction. I hope that gets us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise Antolini. So one thing you said that I was very interested, you said it's, at least as far as that case study is concerned, that it's way past the time for planning. So where does planning fit in this scenario that you describe, which calls for, I think you called it action plans, I think was the term you used. I mean, what's the horizon? I mean, the problem is that planning is a two-edged sword. You can use planning to kick things down the road virtually forever. Or you can use planning to do it right now. And I wonder what your concept is. So where does it fit best in terms of action plans?
That's a great question. I didn't mean to say that planning is not important. Boy, have we all been, we participated in a million plans, all of us. In this particular situation, there are a lot of plans. There's a lot of plans. There's community-driven plans. DOT has offered many different plans. So for actually more than 10 years, there's been a lot of plans out there. In this particular case, it's time to pick a plan and move, and I would say one that's nature-based. So I didn't mean to skip over that, except that a lot of planning's already been done. We need to act in this case. So I think there are other situations like that around the state where people have planned themselves to death, and it's time to invest and try something.
Yeah, one other question before I go to the next speaker, and that is, obviously there's two keynote panelists on this panel from the university, you and Chip Fletcher. And it strikes me that, the universities, and you have been involved in environmental law and the Hawaii the Hawaii Environmental Protection Act for a long time, and efforts to fix it and rewrite it and update it and so forth. What is the role of the university, in the law school, and for that matter, SOEST, in terms of making this happen in the legislature, in this square building here?
At the law school, who was brought to the law school to focus on energy issues, and Maxine Burkett. So we are trying to develop our own capacity to address these issues. We are always thrilled to collaborate across campus, and we've been working with Chip and so many others, and I recall meetings more than, I think there were 10 or 15 years ago, where we were sitting in a little room in the law school talking about sea level rise and if it would ever happen. So we are trying actively to build our capacity to train students in, public utility law and renewable energy.
How about politics?
That's where they need to come down to the legislature and extern, right? Because nobody's going to teach it better than if they come down and get embedded in the legislature. So we very much encourage that.
Yeah.
They get down here and they learn on the job.
Thank you, Denise. Denise Antolini. Chip. Okay, is it something we said? No. Okay, now we're going to hear from the state's Chief Planning Officer, Leo Asuncion, Director of the State Office of Planning. You're going to tell us what the Hawaii State Plan is all about, where we are in that, and what we need to do to make a comprehensive plan that will deal with the impacts of climate change and sea level rise, and effectively be what Denise Antolini calls an action plan. Okay, a warm welcome for Leo Asuncion.
I'm going to try to make it brief. I'm one of those casualties of the WAM briefing in about 5 minutes. So anyway, when we put together, and I want to thank our Energy Forum as well, coming to us and asking if we wanted to co-sponsor the event, and it was about planning. And I think it's planning in general, even though we're trying to specifically look at climate impacts and the like, and its connection even to energy. So took this opportunity to really kind of review my own thoughts on the Hawaii State Plan and things like that. And I was asked to look at it in 3 different ways of how important is the Hawaii State Planning Act and the role it plays for just Hawaii's future in general, right? And my response to that is just look at history. Since statehood, we've had a general plan. Under Governor Burns in the 60s, he updated that general plan. And you look at things like the planning process, the goals for planning, economic growth, population projections, land use, transportation, and public facilities, and even a plan for recreation. Right? And that's in the 60s. Right? Kind of fast forward to really when planning took off in its heyday for the state in 1978 under Governor Ariyoshi. And that was Act 100, which was the Hawaii State Planning Act as we see it today. And it set forth state goals, objectives, policies. It looked at specific areas and sub-areas under that, under population, economy, the physical environment, facility systems, social cultural advancement, and even fiscal management at that time. It introduced a statewide planning system, looking at having state functional plans, county general plans, state programs, and budget and land use decision-making processes. So it's all tied together at that time. There was a policy council that was the forum to discuss conflicts between all of these plans. Unfortunately, that was repealed in 1991. And then it also set what they called at the time priority directions, and simply just economy, growth and distribution, and land resources. Then over time, really when the Office of Planning became a big thing in the 90s, and basically under Governor Wahe at the time, he really looked at revisions to the Hawaii State Planning Act, looked at expansion of objectives and policies. So if you look at it today, this is HRS 226, Chapter 226, in statute. There's a litany of objectives and policies in all of these different areas that we're supposed to be concentrating on, or at least considering when we're making decisions, when we're trying to take action on items or issues that we're up against. And at that time in the 90s, we kind of changed priority directions to priority guidelines. And they added, they combined population growth and land resources, right? Because if you're going to grow, where are you going to put them? And then we also added crime and criminal justice, affordable housing, and quality education, which were big things back in that time. And there were some updates to the functional plans as well between 1989 and 1992. And then state planning went down after that. The administration after Governor Wahe, and really up until 2010 when Governor Abercrombie came into office, state planning pretty much took a nosedive. It was even questioned by even the same people that created the Hawaii State Plan, that group. So resources were taken away from the Office of Planning. It was moved back out of the governor's office, back to DBED. You gotta think, DBED before in the 60s and the 70s was actually the Department of Planning and Economic Development. So, right, the importance kind of took a nosedive, and then when Governor Abercrombie came in, I recall that's when I joined the administration as the CZM manager, and he wanted to bring that back. And even more so now with Governor Ige, right, he remembers all of those functional plans, the great work that was done back then in the 70s, and also some of the staff that sit up on the 5th floor. They were there, they were part of it. So in 2012, 2013, we started to expand economic priority guidelines, and we added sustainability and climate change adaptation. Right, so we have a gamut in the state plan already of things that we need to address, things we need to consider, goals and objectives that all state agencies and really everyone should be striving towards. The state planning act and the functional plans, really what it did, if you look back from the very beginning, it kind of laid out the game plan to move Hawaii from agricultural economy to what we have today, tourism-based economy. And I'll submit to all of you guys that I think we pretty much implemented that game plan, right? Because we're even talking about carrying capacity issues now. How much is too much, right? Where do we put everything? So things like that are coming back in circle. And, Governor recently asked me, what were some of the accomplishments from that original state planning and functional plans? And, today we talk about, and this is kind of digressing into other areas, but we talked about prepaid healthcare. That's a big issue now nationally. We were talking about it 45 years ago, and we actually implemented the Prepaid Healthcare Act in 74. Right, so that was part of the game plan back then. Hawaii is a global tourist destination today. We have pumped billions of dollars of infrastructure for physical infrastructure, right, because of all the growth. Folks affiliated with the university, that's when the university took off and expanded, right, because of the game plan that we need the university to be there to help in research and coming up with solutions to our pressing issues, right? So there was a lot of stuff done, right? And we look at that plan, and, today I kind of sit around and I do talk to the governor about it. Where do we go next? What's the next game plan? Right, we're already talking, right? If tourism is at its peak, what's the next economy? What's going to drive us, right? And how do we implement that? And how do we get it going? So, we've also kind of looked at the state planning as the nexus to government planning and action. It's all embedded in the plan. And I think, I have examples here of different citations in the plan. And one thing that really stands out for me is that it's everybody's business, right? It actually states that in the Hawaii State Planning Act, that it's not only government, it's everyone's business to try to achieve the goals and objectives that are in the plan. So the one thing, I think Sharon asked me, what is the single most important action that we can do? And this is maybe a little bit biased of me because I'm a policy junkie and I like to look at history as well of policies, is take time to really look at the Hawaii State Planning Act in its entirety, right? Not just different sections just because it's sustainability or climate change adaptation or the economy. You look at it in its totality and you get the intent, right? It's a very powerful tool that you can use to really look at how we can get to action items, right? In whatever issue we're dealing with. So I'll leave it at that. I'm going to apologize if I need to run off, but I'll try to stick around for some questions.
No, just one or two. Appreciate it, Leo. So I've been watching Xi Jinping these days and the Politburo in China. They do 5-year plans. And I don't think they take a lot of public testimony on that. They just do it. And guess what? You know, they are able to change the way the economy works, and they are able to get whatever their vision is done. How would you compare and contrast the state plan and the state planning system with the 5-year plans under Xi Jinping?
I think, you know, it depends on where it's coming from. Right? I think that, like any statute, right, it's a policy that's now implemented down at the executive level. And, you know, yeah, we could do it. I have a staff of 2 that look at the state plan. In fact, you know, we've been to the legislature to ask for money for resources to do it the past couple of years. You know, it's not getting any traction. I get some traction. You know, my greatest proponent is actually Senator Hawai. She sat on the original policy council. So she remembers the effort that went into developing the state plan and the functional plan way back when. Right? So she's been my proponent at the time. But, you know, we've been doing it in-house. And, you know, just today I'm supposed to receive on my desk kind of like the phase 1 report of the state of the state plan. Where we are today, what do we need to do, who needs to be updated in their planning. I will tell you that one snippet is that planning hasn't really stopped. I call it that it's been kind of decentralized to the agencies, the lead agencies, the counties and the like, right? But if you try to tie it back into bigger comprehensive, that's what we don't have.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what we need to strive for, to kind of bring it all back together and see where we are as a state.
Leo, how do you propagate the state plan? Do you give it to every legislator? Do you go and talk to them? Do you give it to the public? Do you give it to the agencies? How do they know what's in the plan so as to comply or at least consider it? And the second part of it is, are they considering it? Are they considering the state plan when they adopt legislation in this building?
We are supposed to. We do, you know, from time to time, if we see something that's going to add or change or do something that might impact some goal or objective or policy in the state plan, we do testify on that to inform people. We do appear by decision-making bodies, like the Land Use Commission. We give input to the land board. In fact, you know, Henry will attest to this, and some guys out in the audience. And in the next Terra case, we actually appeared before the PUC and reminded them of their responsibility to consider things that are in the Hawaii state plan. Right? So I mean, we look for these venues. We do comment a lot on EISs that come through EA reviews, whatever, right? Even permits from the county, right? And you know, we try to do it. Even though I only have 2 staff specific, like my entire staff can tell you, right? They would have to probably look it up because they can't know the exact citation, but they can tell you if you might be opposing or that you need to consider certain things.
Thank you, Leo. Leo Asuncion, state planner. And I think it's great that he's here. It's great that he's co-sponsoring this program, because what it tells you is we are at a time in our historical continuum where our planning includes not only sustainability, but it also includes energy. And we are looking at more subjects, and more subjects are being treated and, you know, analyzed in that plan. Well, let's go forward. You have to go to the WAM committee now? Okay, well, thank you again, Leo.
You know where to find me. Sharon knows where to find me, and I'll get you those responses.
Thank you very much, Leo. We're going to turn to science now. What? Oh, yeah. So don't forget that you can ask questions. It's not just me. I'm just chumming the waters here. You have index cards, write them down. Write the questions down and submit them, and we'll ask them. That young man over there is going to see, got the calabash all ready for your cards. Yeah. Okay, and turn to science. The science that persuades us, or at least most of us, I'm not naming names, that climate change is real. It's only a matter of time until the next Iniki, and that could strike Oahu just as easily as it did Kauai, with devastating results on the capital city of our state and the implications of that. Severe storms, including those around Hawaii over the past few years, are quickening. So Chip Fletcher is associate dean of the UH School of Ocean, Earth Science and Technology, SOWEST, with over 20 years of research in this area. And you've heard his name before. He's done magnificent work on charting the erosion of the coastline and the inundation possibilities. He will share his views on the climate change, science, and the community challenges we all face, and how we can understand them, and how we can protect ourselves from them, and hopefully recover from them afterward. Chip was on our Think Tech Energy Wednesday show and last week, I think, to discuss the urgency of the issue. Today, he'll highlight some of the proposals the state and the legislature really ought to consider and adopt this year, 2018. Chip Fletcher, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Sharon, for putting together this symposium, and thank you, everybody, for attending. I have a lot of information for you, so I'm going to charge right ahead. We have already, at a temperature of 1 degree C above background temperature, created a very different world. There's melting ice. We are losing 600 billion tons of ice annually around the world, and this is accelerating. Our oceans are experiencing warming. The dissolved oxygen in our oceans has declined by 2%, and the oceans are acidifying. Extreme weather is on the rise, including heat waves, drought, and various types of storms. Wildfire is larger and more frequent. The U.S. Forest Service budget has, the wildfire in the U.S. Forest Service budget has risen from 16% of their budget to now 52% of their budget. 2017 was the most expensive year in the U.S. for weather disasters. This information came in earlier this week, $306 billion in weather disasters, a record setter. Ecosystems around the world are experiencing local extinction, climate departure, increased exposure to invasives. Food yields and nutritional value are decreasing. Human health is exposed to disasters, heat waves, infectious diseases, and sea level rise is accelerating. And for every one of these tragic lines of information, there are dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles. Here in Hawaii, we experience impacts related to global warming. Hurricanes in our waters are projected to increase. We have over 100 years of decreasing rainfall. Sea level is rising. Our oceans are at risk from warming and acidification. Trade winds are changing. They're turning more easterly. We have ecosystems at risk, and we have increasing El Nino intensity and frequency. And it's under El Nino that we see heat waves, drought, extreme rain, coral bleaching, strong coastal erosion, and record-setting hurricane seasons. So we had thought up until about a month ago that 2014, 2015, and 2016 represented a bend in the curve of carbon dioxide emissions. We had hoped that we could start to decline global carbon dioxide emissions, but news came that 2017 is going to represent a 2% uptick in global carbon dioxide emissions. So we are now once again heading in the wrong direction with regard to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. On the order of 60% of these emissions come from 4 nations: China, the United States, the European Union, and India. You can see that the Indian rate of CO2 emissions is increasing. The European Union has been declining, but now it's flatlined. The US has been declining, but now it's flatlined. And China had been declining with their coal abatement program. but they take an uptick here. And then the rest of the world's nations are still on the increase. What's our progress? National pledges, it turns out, are only 1/3 of what is needed to avoid 2 degrees C of global warming. After 3 years of stable carbon, as I said, we see an uptick in global emissions. And the actual accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere has not stabilized. That continues to increase. And last year we saw a record increase in actual carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And in 2016 is also a very large step up in actual carbon dioxide emissions. And of course, the US is accelerating oil and gas exploration. The continental shelves have just been opened up, and the Arctic as well. So we are definitely headed on a path of 2 degrees C. What will the world look like? Reports from the National Academy of Sciences tells us that wildfires will increase 400 to 800% in size. Hurricanes will be 2 to 8% more intense. 20 to 30% of plant and animal species are at high risk of extinction. The Arctic keeps melting, losing 30% of its annual average ice cover. Crop yields in the US, India, and Africa will decrease 10 to 30%. Freshwater availability will decline 20%. Many regions will become unlivable with tens of millions of refugees, leading to socioeconomic and political turmoil. We're already seeing this happen as a result of Syrian refugees into Europe. We see many countries in Europe turning to nationalism and populism as they attempt to close their borders to Syrian refugees. It might be hard for you to see, but this is our 2017 position with regard to carbon emissions. We have probably missed this downward path into a less than 2 degree world. Some people put the chances of stopping warming at 2 degrees C of only 5% probability. Some other scientists say that the only way that we can stop warming at 2 degrees C is if we engage in massive global carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. Hopefully, we are on our way to a 2 degree or 3 degree world. It's going to be, however, a very different world, one that will not be the greatest place to live. We're looking at multi-meter sea level rise, large regions too hot to live, superstorms in the tropics, and extreme heat every summer. This is economist Arthur Cecil Pigou. He is from Cambridge, and he proposed that actions in one part of the economy can have unintended consequences in others. And in order to depress such activities, he proposed that they be taxed. A Pigovian tax should equal the social cost of the negative behavior. To encourage positive behavior, he suggested subsidies. We apply this principle fairly with alcohol and tobacco. We tax them because they extract a social cost. But we are insufficient with this approach when it comes to gasoline, synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and the transient accommodation tax, for instance. Most advocates still advocate, or most economists still advocate for a Pigovian tax as an efficient way of dealing with negative externalities, negative impacts to the community, rather than government-imposed standards. Based on this approach, I suggest we inventory all carbon in Hawaii and identify the carbon footprint of all of our socioeconomic activities. Use the resulting spreadsheet to identify where we can subsidize negative and low carbon activities and develop an income tax scaled to the carbon footprint of activities that are still high carbon producing. We could be the first large community in the world to define our economy based on mitigation. This, in fact, would be an act of self-preservation. I suggest we increase taxes on carbon and other greenhouse gas creating activities. We use the proceeds to increase the number of electric charging stations publicly available. We develop a government program to enable retreat from beachfront locations. relocate or raise coastal highways, bury power lines, build stormwater management systems to catch fresh water, re-engineer drainage systems, etc. I also recommend we eliminate the general excise tax on fresh food. This will increase the general excise tax for processed food and beverages. This will likely increase Hawaii's food security by promoting locally grown food, and it will likely reduce consumption of processed foods, which are already involved in lots of negative personal health behavior. Moreover, most processed foods are manufactured out of state with a large greenhouse footprint to bring them in. I recommend we increase the state income tax at the highest levels of income, and we use the proceeds to restore funding at Department of Land and Natural Resources. The Hawaii that we hope to leave to our children, the Hawaii of blue oceans and green valleys filled with living things, depends largely on the strength and integrity of DLNR. Lastly, we can each cut our carbon footprint. If we do so at 50% per decade, we have a shot at stopping warming by 2050, stopping warming at 2 degrees C. And the most important things we can do is to reduce air travel, use our car less, have smaller families, and eat a more plant-based diet. Thank you very much.
Chip, I have two questions. You know, if we have a carbon tax and we reduce the use of carbon in Hawaii, remember Hawaii, that speck in the ocean, isolated from other land masses by thousands of miles, with a tiny population in a tiny land area? What effect would that have on global climate change?
Negligible effect from a scientific point of view, but we could be enormously impactful from a leadership point of view. We could show how the whole world has to evolve.
Yes, absolutely. Great idea. I noticed that Denise is clapping also. Okay, Chip, one other question is, you know, we've talked about this. We have El Nino. We've had storms circling Hawaii for the last couple of years, threatening us profoundly. From a scientific point of view, what does it look like? Can you talk about probabilities? Can you talk about what might happen here next summer when El Nino plays out and the storm season begins?
We can't predict what will happen in any year or even decade for that matter, but all the climate models are projecting that we're going to see a higher probability of hurricanes in Hawaiian waters. The tropics are expanding, the subtropics are expanding. The band of tropical cyclones that typically passes south of the Hawaiian Islands are migrating to the north. And so the bullseye is going from south of the Big Island to our windward shores. That's assuming that we have a linear impact. As you said, I think it's only a matter of time before we see a direct landfall of a hurricane. And our hurricanes are getting bigger, wetter, and stronger in terms of their wind speed, more damaging.
In terms of preparation for that disaster, you mentioned a lot of initiatives that could be considered, that should be considered by this legislature, but what about preparing for disaster? Is there anything you have in mind on that level?
Well, that's where new sources of revenue generated on a carbon-based economy could be directed at adaptation steps such as burying our power lines or whatever it would take to harden our grid system against high winds and storm surge. Elevating roads or moving roads away from the coast, otherwise enabling the retreat of our communities and our infrastructure away from the shoreline, and capturing that precious fresh water which falls from the sky every day and simply runs off into the ocean. After more than a century of declining rainfall, that water is going to become very precious, so we need to develop the engineering infrastructure to capture this water. That's called stormwater engineering.
No time to waste. Thank you, Chip Fletcher. Thank you so much. Next up is John Cole. He's former consumer advocate of the state of Hawaii and a PUC commissioner. He's now senior policy analyst at HNEI, the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute at University of Hawaii, Manoa. and that's the research agency that assesses renewable energy technologies for our state. He can tell us what they're working on these days and how it should affect and enhance our planning. A warm welcome for John Cole.
Doesn't matter which way you turn it. All right, thank you, Jay, very much. I'm just going to start out. I was asked to kind of talk about the role of clean energy and adaptation and mitigation for climate change. And one of the main points I wanted to make was kind of just made by Chip in response to Jay's first question. Of course, one of the main things that clean energy can do is help reduce, carbon dioxide emissions on our own turf here as we move toward renewables and use less and less fossil fuels. But like was mentioned, on a global scale, that's kind of a small impact all around. But I think one of the best things Hawaii can do and use what we've gone through as far as our transition so far to renewables and the way we've been trying to handle things is to kind of export that knowledge and help other people realize that even though, they're not at a place where we might be right now, we can help them get a good footing in planning and developing their systems to move forward, hopefully in a quick way that can help mitigate climate change, more than just our own impact by reducing our use of fossil fuels. So basically, I'm just going to talk about some of the programs that HNEI has been involved in that kind of go to this end and explain some of the technologies and other things that we've been working on. Three of the basic programs I wanted to mention is first our Hawaii Energy Systems Development Special Fund. And that's our special fund into which gets deposited our portion, or HNEI's portion of the barrel tax, which is 10 cents of every $1.05 that's charged per barrel of petroleum product imported into the state. And there's a whole statute with various things on how we use that, but at a high level, it's used for analysis, testing, and evaluation of technologies. Okay. And supporting those technologies' integration into the grids to reduce Hawaii's dependence on fossil fuels. Another program I'm going to talk about a little more is our Asia Pacific Technology Education Partnership, where we do research, development, testing, and evaluation of advanced energy technologies, kind of using Hawaii as a test bed. And another is a recent program that we've gotten involved in that's being funded through the DoD called the Asia Pacific Regional Energy System Assessment, where we're developing international partnerships in an effort to enhance energy reliability and resiliency in other locations of interest in the Asia Pacific region, and helping other people learn and learning ourselves in the process. Just a little bit more on the HEPF, or Asia Pacific Technology and Education Partnership. The main objective is to promote commerce and partnerships in the region through advancements in alternative energy research, technology development, and education. Some of the areas we're working in, grid-scale battery storage, hydrogen fuel cell, methane hydrates, biofuels, solar fuels, ocean energy, microgrids, efficiency, and some aspects of transportation. This is also an ONR-funded project or partnership, and part of what HNEI's goal is to do is create these partnerships, whether using our barrel tax money or our federal grant money, which comes from the US DOE and DoD primarily, to form partnerships and bring in other either government agencies or entities or labs and private partners to work on projects to research and develop or test new technologies or ways to integrate these technologies into our energy systems. This is a newer project that we're just getting started here, the Asia Pacific Regional Energy System Assessment. And through it, we're trying to enhance reliability and stability and resilience of energy systems, and try to help others in the Asia Pacific region as they're looking at using more renewables, developing more renewables, and integrating them into their systems. The approach is to help first go in and form partnerships and then do comprehensive, system assessments on their energy systems and look at different technology options, operating strategies that might help them move forward, and policy. And that goes to planning as well. HNEI has been involved to an extent in state energy planning efforts, mostly through attempting to provide independent analyses to decision makers, whether it's the regulatory decision makers, the utilities themselves as they move forward, and make all that information available to everybody so that our independent analyses can help move things forward. There's often, in dockets before the PUC, there's people with interest, certain interests, whether it's a utility or developers putting forth their views, and we feel that HNEI can provide an independent, kind of view or analysis without, promoting any particular interest in trying to move forward, just the knowledge and impacts that certain decisions might make to help, the decision makers move things forward. But anyway, like I said, a main focus of this is to share the knowledge that we have here in Hawaii with other Asia-Pacific countries and islands, and try to identify what policies they have or gaps and help them, fill those gaps by either making recommendations or helping them develop. It could be, planning processes or technology standards or requirements, or even regulatory type policies if those aren't in place yet. And finally, just to go through a few of the technologies we look at, a lot of you are familiar with this, so I won't, or familiar with the types of things, but I won't dwell on any of them. But we look at ocean energy, including wave energy up there on the top left. We're involved in some of the OTEC testing over on the Big Island of Nauha. We do a lot of lab research at UH on different solar technologies, on thin films, and actually painting solar cell type stuff we've been doing. We're looking at high resolution variable, time scale solar forecasting. We've been doing a lot with hydrogen, both the fuel cell facility we have. It's a fuel cell and battery testing laboratory, and also a lot of the fueling infrastructure. We've developed some places that do that on the Marine Corps base, and fuel cell vehicles, and we're looking at, or we are doing a project with Nauha on the Big Island where, the hydrogen electrolyzer is used for, supporting the grid. We also do quite a bit with energy efficiency, mostly in building efficiency and comfort and the built environment. And we've been getting more involved in the policy analyses and trying to support, the state policy decision-making with independent analyses. And lastly, I'm just going to touch on microgrids. We do have a few projects going on, but given that the topic here is kind of mitigation and resilience, it's one of the ways if folks get hit by a big storm like Puerto Rico just did, that might help people get their power on faster and provide for critical facilities like hospitals and schools and other areas. But a few of the projects we've been working on is Coconut Island there in Kaneohe Bay. We're looking at using advanced technologies and DC for solar and storage and things like that, and doing at least part of it as a DC microgrid. We've been doing a lot of work on Molokai with battery storage. And that's a very small grid with a very high penetration of PV, and they have a lot of system issues with that, so we're looking at using various ways of helping that. And we've also looking at various military bases that are interested in increasing their resiliency and reliability with microgrid projects. And I was going to go a little further, but I guess we're also looking at a microgrid project in partnership with Seoul National University in Korea and HEPF, looking at projects on the Big Island at Nelha, the North Hawaii Community Hospital, and also here on Oahu at the University Pier 39 with some of the research lessons got.
Thank you, John. John Cole. So it's about trying to marry renewables, the technology of renewables, and nature. And in that regard, Denise, I have a question that's been passed up for you. How do you define a nature-based solution and differentiate it from other non-nature-based solutions? What are some examples of nature-based solutions if you're in your case study?
Thank you for the question. I didn't want to go through the whole definition, but if whoever asked me that, you can refer to Resolution 77 of the World Conservation Congress, which is all online. So, as I mentioned, it's an action to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that addresses societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Well, that's pretty broad. But an example of that might be a hardened seawall versus allowing the coastline to retreat. That's a great example where instead of dropping bombs on Madame Pele and trying to fight with hardening and technology, you allow the ecosystem to evolve and you basically manage human activity instead of trying to hyper-manage natural activity. Ultimately, in the long run, we know that nature will take its course. It's humans that we need to be worried about. So that's one example that readily comes to mind. I mentioned, cable and big wind versus community solar. Solar, in my view, community solar in particular, is a fantastic example of a nature-based solution that has very significant societal and ecological benefits and very few downsides, although I know there's the production side of it. So those are two examples that come to mind.
Thank you, Denise. Okay, here's another question. Do we need to focus, good question, do we need to focus on making good plans for a sustainable, resilient Hawaii, or do we just need to move forward with our existing plans? We do have existing plans, don't we? If so, where are they? Which existing plans do we move forward on? Panel? I wish Leo was here. We'll have to contact him about this question.
I don't know of an existing plan that is scaled to the enormity of the problem that we will see over the next few decades. So I think we need to make new plans as science has revealed that climate change is going to be enormously disruptive.
Anyone else on that?
Repeat what I said earlier. I love planning. I love planners. It's essential, but we have to start implementing solutions and see if they work. And I just don't think we have any time left. So we have to start experimenting and start investing. And I'm curious, if anybody in the audience can think of a good adaptation and success in Hawaii recently. I'm trying to think of one. And honestly, when I was preparing for this, trying to think of, where have we had success? I think of Hakalau National Wildlife Refuge, where they've been doing reforestation. But I can't think of many others, so I think we need to start just doing it. Not anything, but really investing in action plans, see if they work, scale them up. You can tell I'm impatient. I think we run out of time.
Yeah, we are out of time. Thank you, panel. That was a wonderful discussion. And thank you for answering the questions. We're going to take a very short break to rotate the panels, and we're going to come back. You will see. Don't leave town.
See you. How are you? Great. Happy New Year.
I have a plan, Ron. I have to say that.
Oh, hey. Happy New Year. How are your holidays? Hey, Josh, you can show all the shots. This is the
Okay. Welcome back. Now we're going to find out what's happening around state government on these issues. First up, our policymakers. the leaders who determine the state's priorities in policy, in programs, and in budget decisions. More specifically, we'll hear from the key committee leaders and what they see as important for 2018. From the Senate Committee on Transportation and Energy, Vice Chair Will Espero will give us the Senate's perspective on achieving a sustainable, renewable, and resilient Hawaii. What criteria do they use, should they use, to prioritize policy programs and budget decisions? A warm welcome for Senator Will Espero.
Hello, sir. Aloha and good afternoon to all of you. Senator Lorraine Inouye regrets that she can't be here today. She is the chair of the committee. So I'll try to give a little perspective on what we're looking at or thinking. But we have to look at Hawaii from statehood to now. And you know, the last 50, 60 years was about growth and development. It was about economics, people investing in hotels, tracts of land, housing, people making money, agriculture, and in essence, a prosperous time for those in the past 50, 60 years. To the point where Hawaii has become one of the most attractive places to live, work, and to visit, with now many of those visiting staying here and creating excessive and enormous demands on our limited island state and the resources upon us, which is why we're having this discussion. And I'm actually here to hear more about what you have to say, because we all understand that we're not able to sustain this growth or this processes that are currently happening. You know, our state is becoming a state of haves and have-nots, where you have $5, $10, $20 million condominiums being built, and in the shadows you have people sleeping in the parks and on the sidewalks and in the medial strips because they can't afford rent and they can't afford to hold a job or have full employment or whatever the case may be. So the decisions that are going to be looked at closely are going to be largely and much driven, in my opinion, by the impact on our residents and our constituents and the cost. And what's going to be the cost to their pocketbooks? What's going to be the cost to our businesses? And what's going to be the cost of society and the state as a whole? And obviously we know that we have to modernize our grid, and that's probably been said often and much today. I'm sorry, I've been sick the last couple of days, so I really just came in about 2 hours ago. And but certainly modernizing our grid and making certain that we have a smart grid is going to be key to being able to deal with our energy needs. And of course, investing in things like battery and energy storage is going to be important. And I believe education is going to play a key role too, because our children have to understand what's coming before them. Because if they don't understand, their actions and behavior will likely lead to more waste and excessiveness that they or their neighbors and friends and relatives can't afford. So we need to look at what we have now today and how we can take those assets and maximize them to the fullest. So for example, we've got tens and thousands of acres of fallow ag land. So we need to somehow take that ag land and turn it into an opportunity to invest in biofuels. This is an area I think that we have enormous opportunity, especially now if you don't know. Wow, that was fast, 2 minutes. Hawaii is about to begin its hemp industry. And hemp as a biofuel, I think can be a huge success if it's done right. And as Denise says, we need to look at what's successful, what's out there, what's being done, what's right, and push those efforts and support them and make certain that that government leaders such as us are held accountable. You know, there was a story on the state energy office is not doing its job. Now, I mean, this just came out, and I really haven't had a chance to look into it and see if there's any if it's valid or not. But elected officials, government leaders, business leaders, we need to be held accountable. We need to set benchmarks. We need to set goals. And if those goals are not being achieved, the people need to know. And the people need to understand why or why not. And if why not, what needs to be done to make it happen. And as a government leader, I don't have those answers. I and many of us rely on you experts out there, the business people, the entrepreneurs, the academians. You are the ones who are in the trenches. And we are your servants trying to find that right formula, the ingredients to make certain that the cost of living in Hawaii stays affordable, that our residents have a strong, good quality of life, and this notion as a society of haves and have-nots does not grow, and that gap does not become bigger. At this stage, I don't know what the future of Hawaii is going to be. I don't know if future generations are going to be better off than we are. At this stage, that remains to be seen. But certainly, what we do here and these discussions we have are so important, and hopefully they will lead us to the result that we are all looking for. Thank you very much.
Okay, now on to Representative Chris Lee, no stranger to us, no stranger to energy legislation, is the chair of the House Energy and Environmental Protection Committee. Chris has introduced the nation's first 100% renewable portfolio standard and the community solar bill, soon now to be implemented. We always like to hear from him and look forward to hear about his policies, plans, and the actions of his committee and in the state. A warm welcome for Representative Chris Lee.
Thanks, Jerry. In all fairness, I think there were about a dozen legislators that introduced all of those bills. The one that actually passed was Mike Gabbert's for the community solar project, which, thanks to the PUC, if any of them are here, is finally getting going. You know, I want to just talk about something that I heard in the end of the last panel. Do we plan? Do we start just implementing? And I think the two are not mutually exclusive. I think we do both simultaneously, because we can plan till the cows come home, till, you know, sea levels have risen and everything's changed, and we'll still be trying to figure out what the best path forward is. There's a certain point where you just have to start based on what you know, to the best of your knowledge, is going to be the case, and make that commitment. I think that's partially where we're at right now. You know, we've got some of the best high-resolution science and impact analysis of anywhere on the planet, looking at how climate change and its effects are going to impact us here, both in the near term and in the long term. But it's also a worst-case scenario that we have that data, because now we know what we have to do. We know the minimum, I guess, we should have to do, which is well above what we're doing today. And you know, it's not going to be easy by any stretch, and everybody can drone on about that. But I think the fact of the matter is this: when we talk about how we as a state begin to prepare ourselves for this, one, it's coordination. You got to start talking, I think, which is the value in our climate initiative, which has now become, you know, the Climate Commission, where you have representatives of all the different agencies and levels of government talking. And I think we've seen more productive discussion out of that and cross-coordination than we have in, you know, maybe the decade prior. And that's really exciting, because the counties are doing their thing, the state departments are starting to do their thing, and for whatever trickle of support there is left coming out of the federal government at this point on this particular issue, we need to be able to maximize that and prepare for the day when we will need to make some pretty big decisions collectively, as a communities, and also individually as our different governments and areas of jurisdiction. That also means from the state side, when we talk about our impacts, of course, we've got figures now, you know, $19 billion, which is a relatively conservative estimate and you know, ballpark for impacts to coastal infrastructure in the coming decades, which of course doesn't take into account a whole number of things, or the longer term, you know, what do we do? But having those numbers is key, because now it allows us to make a comparative analysis and figure out, as the senator had said, how we fix our path forward so that these sorts of opportunity costs and actual costs don't drown our economy or drown our coastal regions. And that's something that we're going to have to make some very, very difficult decisions about in the very, very near future. How do we respond to this? What do we triage and prioritize? What do we give up? Which beaches in our communities do we save? Which do we let go? Those kinds of decisions, which are not going to be popular and are not going to be easy and are not going to be an answer that is ultimately going to solve the problem. But they're necessary decisions we have to make now based on the planning and numbers that we have today. We also have got a lot of critical infrastructure, and this has not been the topic of conversation to the extent which I think it's been in other places, for example, Puerto Rico, where you now have a clear scenario in real time for what can happen when you are not prepared, when your infrastructure isn't built appropriately, when the 20th century model of what that looks like is not prepared for the 20th century level of risk present based on the kinds of disasters and other sorts of things that we're seeing. How do we deal with that? And that means, in a lot of cases, really acute, simple actions, like, for example, as the PUC prohibiting the building of new critical infrastructure over, you know, certain criteria and certain size that our economy and our grid depend upon in these kinds of risk-prone areas, flood areas, sea level rise areas, all that kind of stuff. It just makes sense from a disaster perspective. It makes sense from a public taxpayer perspective. It makes sense from a ratepayer perspective. It just makes sense. And in the longer term, how do we update our regulatory infrastructure to deal with this new paradigm and this new era? You know, it's not the fault of the energy office that everything's not solved tomorrow. It's not the fault of the utility that we haven't maximized solar and wind and all the rest of it as fast as we have. It's not the fault of anybody, because our institutions have been built in a different era for a different purpose. And how do we update and modernize these agencies, whether it's the PUC, the CA, the Energy Office, as state entities and facilitators for this conversation, to be able to actually address things in the aggregate as a whole effectively, so that we're not letting issues fall into silos and be lost in the ether, which I think tends to happen from time to time. we have to acknowledge this. We have to acknowledge that things have to change. We can't let things get batted back and forth. And I think there's tremendous motivation and a time crunch to get this done. I think some of the people that work at these agencies, that work at the utility, that work at the industry in general are some of the best, if not the best people working on these issues on the planet, because they're dealing with a situation which nobody else has yet to deal with. And they've demonstrated commitment time and time again. How do we empower them and give them the tools and the authorization to be able to work more efficiently, to be able to ask these questions differently, and actually get things done rather than perhaps let things get mired in some of what we've seen with various issues in recent years. And let me just finally say that through all of this, if we can build that and smooth out that regulatory framework so there's clear areas of ownership and clear responsibility amongst our agencies and amongst the state government as a whole, what then do we build? And how do we build out a more resilient grid, a more resilient, not just energy grid, but economy as a whole, where you empower people to do what is being done right now in places like Puerto Rico in hindsight, splitting the grid up into many, many microgrids, which can be islanded at the right time, which can resist the kind of impacts that disasters have. And also, how do you ultimately build out a marketplace, a true marketplace where you have DER and the kinds of things that empower small businesses and startups and the kinds of folks coming out of the accelerators to be able to actually integrate into that system much more efficiently and actually create those jobs so that there's not just one entity controlling the whole thing. How do we do all this and do it fast because time is running out? That is the job that state government, I think, is tasked with, because it is our obligation to look out for the long-term interest of ultimately all of us. And that's something that, while a difficult discussion, especially this year, I think is necessary to have, and I think we're going to have. At the end of the day, I'm going to skip the whole last, actually most relevant part of what I'm about to say, and I'll take it in question and answer about how we fund all this and which mechanisms we fund and how everybody gets to pay the bills. So I'll leave that little nugget out there. Thank you very much, everyone. My time is up. Look forward to a good conversation.
Thank you, Representative Chris Lee. Okay, Suzanne Case. We're going to hear from another important agency that can keep us sustainable. It's right in the middle of sustainability, the Department of, whoops, have I got the right person? Yeah. Okay, Department of DLNR. The department is leading the newly established Commission on Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation, which has a huge responsibility for stewarding our natural resources. That goes directly to caring for our environment and coastline and our long-term sustainability. No pressure, Suzanne. We've asked her to tell us about her department's plan to build a resilient and sustainable Hawaii, from our forests and our wildlife to our lands and aquatics, a job as big as all outdoors. A warm welcome to Suzanne Case. Suzanne, come down here for the sound. Oh, it works now? Okay, good.
Thank you all for being here and for putting this on. This is about as important a topic as we have here in Hawaii. And so I guess I'll start just by teasing apart a little bit the words of sustainable and resilient, because when they get bandied around, you sort of forget what they mean. But so for me, and I think for most of us, what is sustainable is what's keeping us going. What is sustaining us? Not just is the resource sustainable, but what resources are sustaining us? So the most fundamental one is water. Water, we can't live without water. In Hawaii, for our lifestyle and for our visitor industry, our coastlines, we create our surf, we protect our coastal properties, our fish. People like to eat fish, look at fish, and all of those are very, very basic to our lifestyle and our ability to survive. So those are the things that sustain us. And then what makes them resilient is in the face of what is, a present and increasing real threat to our global existence. It's a very existential threat. Are those resources, are we managing them in a way that will, that they will be able to survive and thrive so that we can in turn survive and thrive? So that's our focus. And we are, I think, DLNR is right at the center of a lot of this, as are many of you. The Sustainable Hawaii Initiative focuses on our energy initiative, our forest initiative, effective management of our forests, 30% effectively managed by 2030, 30% of our marine areas effectively managed by 2030, implementation of our biosecurity plan by 2027, and doubling local food. And so DLNR is straight on into three of those, the forest, water, and invasive species, which is also a key initiative of the Department of Agriculture. But we're right in the center of all of them. And so just as a reminder, we don't have water. This is just our basic work. We don't have water because it comes out of the tap. The tap is the delivery mechanism. It's got a pipe behind it. It's got a reservoir behind that. It's got some sort of a delivery mechanism from our aquifers and our streams. But ultimately, it's there because the moisture in the Pacific passes through here, and our healthy forests capture it. We capture clouds and rain. So it's a very complex system. It's multi-layers of trees and understory and ferns and mosses, and we need that to be in really good shape in order to capture that water. And then it goes into our aquifers. So that's where our water comes from. And I bet you if many of you ask the question of people, where does your water come from? Some will know and some won't. Climate change is a big threat for all of these native forests. And so drought and fire are increasing, and the severity and frequency are increasing them, and they destroy our forests. Diseases like rapid death destroy our forests. And invasive species, invasive animals and invasive plants destroy our forests. So I guess I want to pause here and talk about opportunities for both mitigation and adaptation. So in terms of resilience, we need to do two things. One is we need to reduce the threats, and the other is we need to adapt to those threats. And one of the ways that we at DLNR can reduce that threat is by absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere by growing trees. And we have really good evidence, recently documented monitoring evidence showing that reforestation actually works over time. And this is actually a lot of the restoration projects were a bit of a hope 10 years ago, but they're really panning out. The question was, do we have enough seed bank left so that if you create the right conditions, you remove the threats, the forest can regenerate, our slopes can regenerate. And it's really actually encouraging. It's kind of surprising for me, having been in this for a very long time, that we actually can do this. So that gives us a lot of hope. Just a little bit about this discussion about nature-based solutions and planning. So I think that for me, one of the best examples of a nature-based solution is protecting your watershed, putting your funding into protecting that watershed, as opposed to some years from now having to build a desalination plant. So desalination is very expensive, creates, the salts create their own environmental issue. The energy it takes to take that fresh water out of the ocean and convert it to fresh water, all very expensive from an environmental and economic standpoint. So that's a great example of a nature-based solution versus a technical solution. And in terms of planning, you got to have good planning to know where you need to go. And a good plans. We have good plans, and we are implementing them. So, generally what you need is a far strategic target, maybe 10, 20-year horizon, so you generally know which direction you need to go in. And then you need a plan on maybe a 3 to 5 year horizon, so that you know in what sequence you need to take those steps to get you to that overarching objective. And then you need what are you going to do this year to get you there? But you need to revisit those plans so that they can stay current. You can update them with the work that you've done. You can bring in new information, modify them. That's the adaptation you need. So you need both. You need to have good plans to know where you're going, and you need to implement it. So, for example, every one of our watershed projects have very detailed plans at all of those levels, and so I think it's just critical. Moving on to aquatics, obviously, the threats, Chip outlined them earlier, huge threats to our marine ecosystems, our reefs, from increasing ocean temperatures, acidification, deoxygenization. I think I just made that up, but it's probably a word. And we had some very big bleaching events in the last few years. And a resilient reef is one that is, if you're sick and then you get in a big accident or you get some major disease, you're less likely to be able to recover from that, and you might further decline and die. And so a reef, if it's sick, is going to have a much lower chance of surviving one of these events than if it's a healthy reef. So the overarching goal in terms of resilience is to keep our native ecosystems in good shape and reduce those threats, eliminate those threats as much as we can, so that when you get one of these, a storm or higher temperatures, it can recover instead of die. And make no mistake, if they're not resilient enough, they will die. But then you're in really bad shape. But if they are, there is a good chance of recovery, and that will take us much further into the future. So we have, in response to the coral bleaching events, we have the first ever statewide coral bleaching recovery plan, which outlines a series of strategies we can take in order to keep our reefs resilient. For example, creating a network of herbivore replenishment areas, because sorry. Nope. On. So herbivore replenishment areas, when you get a bleaching event, what comes in is algae, and in much higher quantities than the fish can. If there aren't enough herbivores because they've been fished out, then the algae will take over and smother the coral and give it, and it'll be much harder for it to survive. We also need to keep an eye on the effect of major storms. We've done a lot of work in the last decade to look at the whole Hawai Basin and the effect of a major storm event, which would be quite devastating. When you combine that with sea level rise, you get even more inundation and flooding. So this plan has been with the Army Corps of Engineers, and it's working its way through the approval process in Washington, D.C. for potential matching funds. But these are the kinds of things that we need to think about on a global scale, because the effect of that flooding is extremely devastating, as we've learned from at least 2 major floods in the last 15 years. And then, of course, the work of the legislature and the governor in setting up the new Climate Commission is groundbreaking. We're very excited about it. So many thanks to all who worked on it. Particularly Senator English was a driver in this. And now we have a Climate Commission, and it's established, and we've had 2 meetings so far, and have accepted the sea level rise report that was just delivered to the legislature. We had a delegation go to Bonn, Germany, Governor Ige's delegation to the COP23 climate change conference as a follow-up to the Paris Climate Accord to begin to orient Hawaii to the ways that other states and countries are taking steps to implement the Paris Climate Accord, which is now the work of the Climate Commission, is to try to guide the various agencies in Hawaii in the work of actually implementing that under the new statute setting up the Climate Commission. Sea level rise report, and obviously many of the divisions, other divisions at DLNR have a lot to do with impacts of climate change. So the Office of Conservation on Coastal Land, dealing with coastal erosion. Historic preservation is going to have increasing challenges to historic sites along coastal areas, buildings and burials. We're going to see a lot more challenges along those lines. State parks with impacts of major storms and the like. And with that, I will pass it on to not Scott Enright.
Wait, Suzanne. First, thank you very much, Suzanne Case. So I remember a talk you gave to the Harvard Club just after you had been appointed. I don't know if you remember that. It was the Guardian Tower there. And some thoughts here is that it seems to me that even during your tenure, but over the past few years in any event, the job of DLNR has gotten much more complicated and demanding. For one thing, there are more attacks, so to speak, on the environment. There are more invasive threats on the environment. And for another thing, the public expects DLNR to take care of the environment. And I guess for another thing, these storms that we worry about might hit Bishop Street, they will hit every part of the state. And we not only have to protect the people, but we have to protect the land. So, you know, it's a tremendous task, as big as all outdoors, and increasing, it seems to me, all the time. And so the question I put to you is, for all this increasing obligation you have, do you have enough money? Do you have enough staff? Do you have resources at DLNR? And to the fellows at your immediate right, could they help you? What would you say to them about whether you have sufficient resources to conduct this job?
Of course we don't. The question is, you know, what can we do with the resources that we have, and what could we do with more resources? And so what we try to do is the best we can with the resources that we have. But, you know, 30% effective management by 2030. Why isn't it 100%? Well, it's because we think 30% is doable. And we've done the planning to talk about how to get there. And even that will take a lot of resources. And so we do count on our legislators to provide the funding necessary to do certainly the basics. But, you know, in order to do this, I think that as the threats of climate change become more and more clear to us, we're gonna need to invest more and more in the solutions from the side of sustainability and nature. You're also going to see impacts on our, you know, human impacts as well. So these folks have to balance those with, you know, the other challenges that we have in the state. But clearly, this is a nature problem. And I just want to add one thing on the question of, like, what does it matter what we do on the global scale? And, you know, the answer is we have to try everything. We have to try everything on the mitigation side. We need to try everything we can to reduce carbon emissions and eliminate them as much as possible. And then we have to do everything that we possibly can to adapt and to create resilient ecosystems and a resilient society. But that's the answer. It doesn't matter whether we make a difference or not. We have to do everything possible because this is an existential crisis, and that's how we need to respond.
Yes, well, thank you, Suzanne. But let me go further and say, if we have to do everything we can, doing everything we can costs money. So I really would elicit the comments of Senator Espero and Representative Lee on this.
Every department and agency would like more money. Our dilemma here at the Capitol, and as you all know, is that the revenues we receive are this big, and the wants and desires of everybody is this big. Year in, year out. It never changes, folks. So one thing we have to do is spend our money wisely and or find new revenue streams, because these demands and needs are not going to go away, and they're going to continue to grow, especially as our population grows and being on this limited island that we live on. If we can find different revenue sources instead of your income tax, your property tax, or the general excise tax, that's what we'd like to do. And if you could help us, please do. Because nothing is free, as you all know. What we're talking about is going to be costly, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, over the decades, and someone has to pay for it. I don't have that answer. Maybe adult use is one way to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. There may be other ways, but that's the big dilemma and the big gorilla facing government at all levels. How do we fund and sustain what we're required to do for everybody? A new high school today costs $120 million minimum. An elementary school, $60 million.
Okay. Representative Lee, perhaps you have the answer.
The cost of doing nothing will far exceed the cost of doing something. Do you want me to expand?
That's it? No, go further.
Let me get on a soapbox for a minute. You know, we have a long history, both here in Hawaii and in this nation, of doing incredible things when challenge requires it. From building the interstate system, to developing even the internet, to doing all kinds of amazing things going back to the time of Roosevelt and before. We've innovated, we've created, we've built, we've made those commitments and that investment. Today, we are far behind nearly every other modern Western nation in making those kinds of projects become reality. We have not invested in our infrastructure, we've not invested in our economy, we've not invested in our next generation in the way that we've needed to, that we've been long since eclipsed on almost every major statistic by nearly every other place. It's hard to say when we talk about us being the greatest country on the planet. But if we do want to make America great again, then I think that comes with a commitment, and that comes with a hard decision, and it comes with an investment that is required. And it's not just pulled out of our future, but it's investment that we commit to today, and we pay for it today. And I think if we want to see those things, we have to do that. We have mechanisms, we have resources that are yet untapped. We have the ability to implement and call down on that if we have the political will. If we have the public standing up saying, yes, we want to do these things. If we have people saying, you know what, it's more important that we have effective solutions for these problems, and I'm willing to pay 10 cents on the dollar for whatever it is along the way to have that. I think we can do that. But I think it has to be messaged appropriately. I think it has to come out of this group of folks in a way that is not just an academic paper that's a phone book thick, but rather a soundbite that is digestible by even a second grader. Because it's when those voices echo what these challenges are and the need for them to their parents, to policymakers, to all of us, that things begin to change. It is a generational issue in that respect. And it is about investing for that next generation. I think we can do it.
Thank you all for that discussion. Okay, we're going to move on to other agencies. We're going to hear from the State Department of Transportation, David Rodriguez. It's a critical agency that uses energy in moving people, goods, and services to and from and within our state and among its islands. We're pleased that David Rodriguez, who's a special assistant to the Director of Transportation, is here to share the department's plan for a sustainable and clean transportation system. He's been instrumental in facilitating the Department of Transportation's Sustainable Transportation Forum, which brings diverse stakeholders together to work on sustainable transportation initiatives. David, tell us what's happening at DOT and what's planned. A warm welcome for David Rodriguez.
I am not he. I did want to say,
What do I know?
we have to run off. I actually just got called upstairs by the administration on important things are brewing. But did want to say on that issue of funding and all of that, we want to provide that support to the departments to execute, I think, the great mission that's out there. I think there are resources, and not to be vague about what I just said a minute ago, but we've got, I think a couple of folks talked about this, or probably talked about this earlier, a lot of options from both the Tax Review Commission and other places about how to raise revenue in a way that can be not only budget positive, but also reduce the regressivity in the kinds of taxes that people currently today pay with a long-term benefit. Like I said before, I think the cost of doing nothing far exceeds over the long run the cost of doing something on this. So when it comes to that, there will be bills which are being drafted right now that specifically speak to funding and to commitment of resources over the long term.
Thank you,
Now for the
Representative
man of
Lee.
the hour.
And thank you, Senator Aspera. Appreciate you coming down.
Anyway, first of all, I wanted to thank the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum for inviting me and for Sharon for twisting my arm to present here to you today to share the DOT's perspective. I wasn't sure what to talk about, but everybody thinks that the DOT has a plan. Really, what I can tell you is that I could share what we've programmed, and it's basically that there used to be this Commission on Transportation that died, and it was reborn with what we call now the Sustainable Transportation Forum. Basically, the forum provides stakeholders of various transportation sectors discussion opportunities to ensure that environment, social, and economic considerations are factored into decisions affecting transportation activities that can be sustained into the indefinite future without causing irreparable harm to future generations of Hawaii. Thanks to people like Asia Yuri there in the purple, who introduced me to the Governor's Institute on Community Design, to help facilitate a lot of this discussion, we've been able to move forward at the department to the point where we've actually changed our mission statement. And that mission statement, which is sort of like, it kind of guides the department because it's changed its it's changing its culture by just adding the word sustainability to our mission statement. And our mission statement reads as, to provide a safe, efficient, accessible, and sustainable intermodal transportation system that ensures the mobility of people and goods and enhances and/or preserves economic prosperity and the quality of life. Now, with that vision statement, the kinds of things we program, works towards that goal of sustainability, given the energy goals that are, we try to align ourselves with everything that has been already set in policy. So, as you know, the DOT is special funded. And so, a lot of it is, we try to do things that make sure that with those special funds, the users get the kind of system that they want. So with the Governor's Institute of Community Design, on the ground transportation side, we're actually looking into how we do project selection and design that's aligned with the governor's, with the state sustainability goals. This would include like land use planning, or better land use planning, intermodal options. And so, talking about intermodal options, we just submitted a ferry study. There's people would like to use the ferry, I think, but is it going to be a viable system? A ferry system would require high subsidies. And so, and that's what the report kind of says. But it helps us, with the vision statement, helps us decide what types of studies we move forward with. One was the water scalping one, which, addresses water consumption and use and reuse of water. And so, the DOT, commissioned a report on that, and that was out last year. The ferry study we completed this year. And so these are the kinds of things that we're programming at the department. As far as on the airports and harbor side, a lot of it is really, we run those two divisions like enterprises, to bring value to those that pay the user fees for that. And a lot of what we can do there is create efficiencies. And with efficiencies, it's just realigning of like in the harbor system, if you're a shipbuilder, you're in this side of the harbor. If you're involved in freight, you're on this side of the harbor. It's just realigning a lot of that thing. By creating efficiencies, it saves energy. It does things like that. And the same thing's happening with our airport modernization plan, which also includes a CONRAC, right? And the CONRAC is really a good demonstration project to test a lot of the things like renewable energy as far as what the type of busing we would use for the area. If we talk about on ground transportation highways, right now, one of the key things is, sorry. So when we talk about sustainability also, sustainable transportation should also include funding. And where sustainability is defined along these, we define it along 3 dimensions. Revenue, that is stable, reliable revenue, sufficient to maintain Hawaii's transportation system like a utility. It should include the stakeholders, and it should be transparent and fair transportation funding sources for Hawaii's residents. And it should include energy, transportation funding sources and uses that align with the state's environmental protections and energy efficiency policies and goals. And so one of the things we're looking at is right now we're looking at, we have a demonstration project, which is the road use charge. Currently, right now, you're paying a gas tax, a vehicle weight tax, all these like user road taxes. And to make it more viable and fair, one of the things we've programmed in is this road use charge demonstration study. And it's a 3-year study, and it's just basically trying to figure out a fair system for the road users of the system. Because as you know, we did not get the funding increases we wanted. We, for several years now, have asked for a gas tax increase, a vehicle weight increase, but all those were denied. And so, currently at the DOT, we have no real capacity projects online only because of lack of funding. And that's always going to continue to lag, and that's why the DOT is commissioning this demonstration project, just to find out, what would be a fair way to charge people that use the roadways. And with that, I want to thank you for your interest.
Thank you, David Rodriguez. David, we're always interested in what the Department of Transportation is doing to incentivize renewables on the highway, for example, battery storage and charging stations and electric vehicles and so forth, and at sea. And so I understand that Young Brothers was considering LNG to drive its ships as an alternative fuel. I also understand that one fellow who was advocating for LNG used to be at the Hawaii Gas Company's Joe Boyven, moved over to the CEO job at Young Brothers. Does this bring us closer to using LNG as a fuel in our maritime operations? And do you support that?
Well, we do support at the DOT the use of LNG for transportation purposes only. However, with our fuel storage, I'm not seeing any movement on LNG, as there's not been any requests for LNG type fuel storage at our harbors. And until I see that,
There won't be any LNG. Yeah.
there hasn't been any real movement on the LNG.
Okay. Are there any other questions for this panel? Do we have any other questions?
Can I just add,
Please, Suzanne.
just to keep the thought in mind that liquid natural gas, the bulk of it is a fossil fuel, and so it depends on what the source is. If it's from methane recaptured from a plant, that would be a renewable energy as opposed to a fossil fuel based one.
Yeah. Question over there.
Thank you for your comments, Suzanne. The sea level rise report just came out, and I know that the administrative package for legislative actions went in several months ago. What is happening, what can we expect to see at the legislature with regard to the sea level rise report? And are you guys working on a package of suggested legislation, or are you going to do that for 2019? How is that playing out?
Well, I think we're all digesting it. It's as you know, a technical report. It provides solutions. It provides information on which to base policy decisions, setbacks and coastal erosion kinds of policies. So it's for all of us to think about what the right policies are to address this, now and for a long time coming. So I think that's a work in progress.
Thank you, Chip. Any other questions in the House? In that case, I'm going to thank this panel, including its two members who, oops, there is a question. Where?
I have a multiple-part question. My name is Albie Miles, and I focus on food and agriculture studies at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. So a general question would be, is the current model of state planning and implementation compatible with the rates of change and conditions of destabilization already occurring and anticipated under advanced stages of climate change? Do we have the apparatus intact to actually respond to the conditions of destabilization? So that would be my first general question. And then my second question has specifically to do with the food and agricultural sector. And it's been touched on briefly in a couple of the comments. So I'm interested in knowing what plan is there, if any at all, and a process by which we will assess the vulnerabilities in the current food system, define benchmarks and an implementation and action plan to establish a more resilient food system that takes at one of its key objectives to ensure equitable access to food under the conditions of climate destabilization and likely food price volatility. So I know that was a bit of a mouthful, but I'm
No,
concerned.
I think David can handle that easily. Suzanne, you want to take a whack at it?
Here we go. Sorry. Well, that is a very big question, and probably a great one for our previous panel as well. And I guess the answer is probably yes and no, of course. I mean, we have plans to tackle the threats as we see them. There are much bigger threats looming on the horizon, obviously in the food and agriculture sector. We need that kind of planning too, but I'm not the right person to answer that question.
Okay. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, David. Thank you, panel. Great discussion. We're going to switch out the panel now. We're going to have the county panel, the one you've all been waiting for. Okay, this is the final panel. It's the counties panel. The counties are very important to our state's sustainability and well-being. They are at the front lines, making the plans and making the plans work at the community level, on the ground. Although Hawaii is a small group of islands in the middle of the vast Pacific, we're connected to, dependent on, and led by the efforts of our counties. We've asked representatives from the planning, sustainability, or energy departments from each of the counties here today to tell us their plans for sustainability and resilience, and to share with us the most important challenges they see in 2018 and what they need to meet those challenges. Let's start, if everybody's ready, with Hawaii County. Okay, and that means Ron Whitmore. He's the man with the lei. Ron Whitmore is the Deputy Director of Hawaii County's Department of Development and Research. He's going to tell us about Hawaii County's unique challenges, how they're incorporating sustainability initiatives into their comprehensive plan, and what they need from the state to proceed with their efforts. A warm welcome for Ron Whitmore. Oh, that's right, I'm sorry. Let me switch that. Yeah, okay, everybody agreed, and I agreed too. 1 second. All right.
I'll work with that. Thanks.
Instead, we're going to switch it because of transportation issues. Mike Helig is going to speak, and he is from Kauai. He's the Director of Planning for Kauai County. Kauai County and KIUC have been forging ahead in clean energy and with some pretty ambitious energy-efficient multimodal transportation planning. So we want to hear about Kauai's plans and what we can expect this year in Kauai. So let me skip around to say a warm welcome to Mike Helig. Thank you for your patience.
No problem. Before we kind of delve into a bit of the presentation, I know I only have about 8 minutes here. I am a land use planner. As much as I have my former law professor in the audience here, I am in the profession of planning. And in as much as we deal with what science is involved concerning how our society is changing, it's just as much about managing emotion, human emotion, because ultimately, through our system, power is coming from the people, and people tend to act on emotion, not necessarily on the science, as much as we would like them to. And so part of the goal of what we try to do when we pose problems or issues to the community before we get to a community-based strategy is to look at trying to explain what the issue is and say, and here are the options. Let them be empowered and feel empowered and have the information to actually make that decision. What we see a lot is that people get people to accept what is happening is part of our goal as planners in trying to move them towards a goal. And that's why, in as much as we would like to have a lot of our strategies push us and turn on a dime, part of our goal is to actually look at it over the long term. Chair Case talked about it, the 10, 20-year horizons, and we have to essentially try to turn a tanker on a dime, and it's not pretty, and it's not what we would say ideal, but it is the cards that we in effect are dealt with. So in essence, what we have to pick and choose what we focus on. And then once we pick and choose what we can focus on and focus the community's attention on, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, how do we accomplish that? And that's essentially the implementation strategy on Kauai. We've been just trying to be very general about. Focus on simplicity and really try to put out there and say, okay, what can we focus on here? What can we achieve as a community goal? And then what are we willing to give up, or what are we willing to change in order to accomplish that? Just two very, very basic things. What we present to when we present it to the community, and we're going through a general plan process, and I'll explain what that means in a second. When we look at our petroleum use throughout the state, you look at it, more than half comes from just these two uses alone. And because we, again, are inherently consumers as humans, we have to look at the rate of consumption and say, you know, if our goal at the end of the day is to have something that is sustainable, things that are less carbon effective, what's generating these effects as we consume? And 52%, based on this estimation, is coming from electricity and from our ground transportation sector. So we purposely go out to the public and explain, you know, here's how you're affecting the environment. What are you willing to change in your behavior to bring this down? And some people say, hell no, I'm not going to change it, right? But we have to pose the tough questions and say, you know, you are affecting this change. You know, I gave a talk one time about making babies. And making babies creates more consumption. And as much as we don't want to necessarily accept the reality of that, we have to get people to accept that truth, that their act of making babies, and I don't mean to make fun of that, but their act of making babies is creating consumption. We look at our ground emissions, right? And this comes from various sources, and Ben Sullivan, who's part of this forum, he gave me this slide. Again, you look, ground transportation is a very large part of our emissions. Again, how do we change, if we want to reach this goal of carbon reductions, how do we look at what is the biggest contributor to our own county's emissions pie right here, and it's ground transportation. So in our realm and what we're given by state mandate, we have this set of tools from a land use standpoint, general plan, our regional plans, our specialized plans, and then we have regulatory ability with zoning and permitting and regulation. How do we take what we know, tell the public, hey, do you want to change this or not? And then use these tools that we have to say, hey, okay, what are you willing to change or give up? And so what we embarked on is this process of updating our general plan, required under HRS 46.4. And in order for the counties to even exercise zoning authority, we have to be able to go through the planning process and explain what our goal is by the year X, Y, or Z. As I said, communication is a very big part of this. How do we communicate to the public what is the long-term strategy? And so, again, simplicity. We got buy-in from the public through our community process to say, okay, what do you want? You want a sustainable island? Yes. You want it to be equitable and beautiful? Yes. Do you want it healthy and resilient? Yes. And do you want opportunity for everybody? Yes. And, you know, I think all of us, at the end of the day, if you're looking at what the dinner table conversation that you have with your families or with your friends over glasses of wine, you're probably going to get 99.9% agreement up and down the board with these four goals. Very simple. How do you implement and get to these goals? Well, again, we get to this discussion of policy. How do we make policies simple, but at the same time pull everybody in the same direction? We came up with 19 policies, and that's it. 19 policies throughout our general plan, but what, from an interwoven standpoint, what we're looking at in terms of energy, we look at these three at the top there. We know that we want to prepare for climate change. We want to shift to clean energy, and we want to build a balanced transportation system. And those three elements, if you can communicate that to the public and try to build support around that, has helped us to look at more specific items per sector in terms of actions. We take those policies, we look at actions throughout our general plan, and we place emphasis on it by sector. And so energy sustainability is one of our 10 sectors throughout the general plan. And it's really been built upon the ideas that we get through our community process. This is what we're hearing from the public. It's what our county wants. You know, we want to be a leader. We want as much clean energy as possible. We want clean tech companies to be established. And so those ideas are translated ultimately into actions per area. Permitting actions, what do we need to study further, what projects and programs do we need, and where from a county standpoint do we partner with each other. And so you see on the right where, again, it aligns with our big goals and our policies. How do we move towards a better area, a better energy balance here? And then we're very bold in trying to say, look, you know, we can't keep expanding the footprint of our ground transportation, our ground transportation footprint. And so how do we work within there at the same time be able to accommodate the additional capacity that's needed as we continue to grow as a society? So, you know, our council adopted these goals, but you know, it doesn't take as much of a shift, but percentage-wise, we're looking at doubling the amount of our the amount of multimodal transportation options that we have on the island. So more biking, more walking, but how do you do that, right? Again, from a land use context, how do we do that? And so, you know, these are some of the items that we're looking at. You know, how do we look at our road system? How do we look at our transit program? How do we look at our pedestrian program? You know, how do we make our communities more livable and appealing, but at the same time reduce the amount of, again, carbon emissions, the amount of ground transportation costs that are needed in order to live in a society like that. So this, I guess, gives you a clue in terms of how we've been trying to approach the overall big picture item, and we're trying to implement it from a land use context in our general plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Mike DeHealy. Mike, you're familiar with this group that met maybe 3 weeks ago among all the counties and compared notes on sustainability?
No.
Okay, well, let me put it this way. You spoke about getting input from the people in Kauai. Are you getting input from the people in Oahu, in Maui, in the Big Island also?
Well, the three other planning directors and myself, you know, are constantly in contact with each other. And we take the approach that knows we don't hold the monopoly on any of the good ideas or any ideas for that matter. I mean, that idea exchange across counties from an enabling standpoint from what the legislature gives us is the same. So how we work within those parameters of home rule can be easily translated from county to county. So we don't work in a silo. We think that trying to share those ideas across channels is probably a better approach. And we learn a lot from the other counties too in terms of how they're approaching some of these sustainable land use strategies.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions for Mike? Okay, well, thank you, Mike DeHealy. Appreciate. I know you've got to go to the airport, so when you have to leave, it's okay. All right, and then I'm going to repeat myself and talk about Ron Whitmore. He's the guy at the other end of the table. Oh,
No, I
where's
guess I'm
he?
going next.
What?
Fred's going next.
Oh, Fred's
Me,
going next.
Yes.
What do I know?
I don't know.
Okay, just wait a minute while I introduce you then. I'm flexible. Okay, Maui, Fred Riddell, he's Maui County's Energy Commissioner. He recently took ThinkTech around Maui and Molokai, and we made OC16 movies about each of those visits, and we had some talk shows about the energy facilities on those islands. So Fred's going to tell us about Maui County's plans and proposals, and I can tell you that they are very interesting, I can tell you that. A warm welcome for Fred Riddell.
Thanks, Jay. This won't be about baby making, don't worry. I'm an engineer, so it's, hugging is confusing. All right. So thank you all for letting me address you about this important, point here, and about how energy relates to sustainability. I think this is really obvious for so many people, every single person here. So the County of Maui has been interested in energy, constantly has and taken an active role in how it affects our citizens, how the cost of energy affects our citizens, any matter with respect to energy, and it's something that the the mayor has been actively involved in for a while. So, as you may know, in the past years, the county even commissioned a study looking at utility ownership and regulatory models. It's a very limited study, not as big as the study that the state is currently undertaking, or at least not as largely funded. But that was to look at, how can we do better, or what can the county learn about a greener future and a better future for our citizens with respect to energy. So with that, of course, as we see at the moment, our utility has a rate case and a proposal to increase the rates by almost 10%. This is, going to affect our citizens. It doesn't matter whether it's a result of the general cost of doing business, whether it's with respect to trying to meet the renewable portfolio standard. It's going to have or create, an impact and have perhaps negative unintended consequences that result from this. So just a little quick update, though. As you may know, the county committed to a sustainable future as evidenced by the mayor's commitment to the Paris Agreement. And as you saw with the other mayors, of course, this took place earlier in June here at the state capitol, where Governor Ige and the 4 other county mayors convened, pledged adherence to the Paris Accord standards, and to join the Climate Mayors Initiative. And it's something that now we're all collaborating on, which is a great thing. Sorry you weren't there, Ben was there, but it started. All right, so as part of this commitment, as I was just mentioning, the county is starting to develop its climate action and adaptation plan. And I'm sorry if I'm slurring a little bit. I broke a tooth yesterday on an unfortunate fruit incident. Yeah, of course. So in addition to that, the mayors got together and pledged to 100% renewable ground transportation goal by 2045, and 3 of the mayors also looking at trying to transform the fleet by 2035, their county fleets, to renewable transportation. So these are some of the things that we're trying to do. So as we aspire to implement these goals, we have to look at sustainability in a complete way, examine our choices with a complete system analysis, rather than choosing and implementing an action without considering the impacts in the related sectors. And of course, you heard people talking about this, about planning. What are we going to do? We have to do something. Of course, we have to, though, look at what those impacts might be. Some examples here. So with our electricity rates set to rise, as I mentioned a moment ago, what you could see is, folks now making a choice to self-generate power, and perhaps the way they self-generate that power might not be renewable, and this may then have the consequence of people defecting from the grid. All of these things may not be a good outcome of what we see going on. This, of course, then, if people start self-generating through, say, combined heat and power, cogeneration, what we may see there is an undermining of meeting this RPS goal, where if people start to self-generate using propane, having something that's more efficient but cheaper because they want to meet their goals, they may then end up producing carbon, and then, we really aren't going in the right direction. So we have to make sure that we're all going in the right direction, the same direction. And the other consequence of this is, if everybody's leaving the grid, this leaves, for our citizens and everybody's citizens, people left on the grid paying for the grid that isn't getting cheaper and is going to be more expensive for each one of those people. So we have to make sure that we're looking at those problems and trying to solve those problems. So it would seem that the legislature might want to look at whether or not the RPS is structured sufficiently to avoid these issues. So ultimately, we need to get to increasing market competition. This is something that came out of our study about utility ownership and regulation. So we want to make sure that there's a way to get there. So in 2012, Hawaii passed a law known as the Hawaii Electricity Reliability Administrator. This would be an entity that have authority over interconnection and authority over reliability. That authority would be delegated to them from the PUC. And it would, for me, be the start of would be a Hawaii-specific independent system operator, something that Chris Lee mentioned about actually having someone else manage the grid. It sounded like to me. I was hoping it sounded like that. And so what we really need here is something that allows for competition to come into the market, something that allows for innovation to actually be adapted into our grid, and something like that, which is used all over the mainland and other areas. An independent system operator model is really what we need, but it just has to be tailored for Hawaii because our circumstances are different. We're not on a bulk electric system, but we need to figure out how to get the right pricing and the right pricing signals. You can't have pricing signals if you don't have a market, and so we need that market. So let's see here. So let's see. I'll go faster because I saw a sign here. So one of the other things I want to point out, though, too, is that we have to start to look at the carbon intensity of the choices that we make. Renewable alone doesn't mean low carbon. It's just as simple as that. Renewable doesn't mean low carbon. It may mean lower carbon than one alternative or another, but it doesn't mean low or no carbon. So let's see here. Some of the other things I wanted to make sure we consider, sustainability, when we look at this whole picture, we want to look at whether or not we're impacting other areas and whether if we're going to start using water to make energy through different processes, that's going to have an impact. If we're looking towards the future of our fresh water, we have to be able to make sure that we're preserving that for the future growth that we will have and the need for fresh water versus using water intensively to make energy when other processes are possible. Let's see. And then, let's see. So I can get down. I had a lot more than that, but let's see. We'll switch it down to some of the quick things that the county's doing. Community-based renewable energy, that was recently approved. What we want to do there is use county land to make that program cheap. We want it to be mostly used for low to moderate income folks. And we want to figure out a way to guarantee the revenues of that so it's not difficult to implement those sorts of projects. The county could put its meter into a program, be a fungible meter, guarantee that revenue without having to appropriate new money, and then we could see the program grow. We could see people being able to go into the program, people be able to leave the program, and it could be a managed program. That's how we want to help make sure that the good things that started at the legislature, that make it through the PUC, that we can actually figure out how to help those move. We're also participating in the Fast Demand Response Program, so we'll continue in that, try to make sure the grid can be flexible without new investment, which would be great. And we're actively studying our fleet now to make sure that we're following following the law with our procurements, making sure that we're making a choice that is possible if there's an alternative vehicle like an electric vehicle or something that we could implement into our fleet, that we're actually doing that, we're making the right choices. So let's see. And I think that's about all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Fred, you spoke about the independent model, the independent operator model.
Yes, sir.
And
Yes.
there was a statute to that effect a couple of years ago?
It wasn't exactly to that effect. It was the Hawaii Electricity Reliability Administrator. And what it did was, it would put the PUC currently oversees reliability, oversees, the requirements for reliability and interconnection. Of course, it's a two-way conversation just with the PUC and the utility. The utility can say, I need this requirement for reliability, which of course is the same thing as I need this requirement to make an investment. And so what you want is somebody independent in that picture that has the complete grid knowledge to say, yes, this makes sense. We're going in this direction. This reliability standard, or this amount of a generation that's available at any moment is the right number. So that's really this, let's say, this cornerstone of what would be an independent system operator. But what you want to get to in time is the way other grids are managed is what's the least cost way to operate this grid? Coming up with a locational marginal pricing for every location on the grid. On the mainland, of course, it's largely, right now, the independent system operator at the bus bar throughout the large portion of the transmission system is where pricing is determined, and then generators are dispatched or not dispatched, turned down, turned up, depending on how that price would change, and you're trying to operate the grid at that correct price. What we could get to and what we will get to, yes or yes in the future, is that everybody is a generator, everybody has storage, everybody has something, and that grid has to be managed in a way that the pricing and the decisions people make and what they take from the grid or what they give to the grid is done at the right price. And that's what ultimately you need, but that's not where the law is at the moment, but that's where the law will maybe need to be, or a different law.
So, yeah, I guess what stands between us and the implementation of a system like that, independent system, operating system, is
I mean, it's going to, it's going to happen, yes or
legislation,
yes,
is that it?
I think. I'm sorry?
It requires legislation.
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Okay. Would it create another layer of cost for the consumer?
Absolutely. And it would also give a big layer of savings. So, you know,
Okay.
so that's what you're looking at. You could look at MISO, the Midwest Independent System Operator. This is the classic. It's going to cost more money. We're going to have another layer. You know, and you could see there, as soon as you bring in all those resources and all of these things are available to solve problems at a market price, not at a single price that you first pay for and then you pay for the next 20 years, then you can actually drive down cost. If you can aggregate the value of all the resources, you get a lower cost. If you just allow the need to be satisfied by a limited number of investments, the cost can't go down.
Thank you very much. Fred Riddell, County of Maui. Yeah, I don't know who goes next. I hesitate to introduce Ron Whitmore yet again. Who's next? Will he raise his, is it Josh? Are you next? Okay, that's Josh Stanbro. He's the newest office in the city and county of Honolulu is the Office of Climate Change, Resilience, and Sustainability. It has significant funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and clear support from the community. Josh Stanbro is the director. He'll tell us about the city's plan and what they want to do in the coming year. Please welcome Josh Stanbro.
Thanks, Jay. It's amazing. I love doing these things because you get to find out what you have in common with your panelists. We have a law professor in the audience that Mike and I share, and I have a chipped tooth as well that came from a beer bottle I was trying to open in Samoa in my 20s, so it wasn't fruit. It wasn't as innocent as Fred's. So thanks so much for having us here. This is the new office that Jay's talking about that has been in existence. I was hired May 1st, so we're relatively new on the scene. The other three counties had sustainability directors that were dedicated long before Honolulu did, so we're sort of late arrivals, but with some of the support that Jay was talking about, we've been able to sort of hit the ground running and try to ramp up quickly. This is really, I mean, the numbers are impressive. I don't think we should be distracted, you know, when we get together like this and, you know, it's a small room and there's a few people. The awareness and what is in front of us is shared by folks out in the community. This office passed with, you know, 18% margin, which is a landslide in today's elections. Establishing an Office of Climate Change with that right up in the title, which is not to be replicated. There's no other city or county in this nation that we've found so far that has an office that's dedicated to climate change. So I think we shouldn't lose fact that as we propose some of these things, we should push our ambitions a little bit harder and further, because the folks that live close to the land in an island environment know exactly what they're up against, and I think in some ways are more willing to accept some of the sacrifices and some of the advantages that both Mike and Fred had put out there. And that in the charter, this is what we're supposed to be doing: greening city operations, looking at reducing emissions and trying to adapt to climate change, basically staffing the new Climate Change Commission that got established at the same time in the charter for the city and county to be advising the mayor, the council, and our office about what to do around climate issues. So the focus for our next year of activity in the office is really going to be built around implementing the Paris Agreement, when all 4 mayors and the governors signed on to Paris, we did so saying that we would do certain things. And our office is in charge of doing those things around tracking, setting a reduction target, and then putting together a plan over the next year to reduce emissions over time towards a goal. Obviously, the mayors also work together, and the counties have been really working together in a coordinated way, which we're really proud of, in making an announcement of a commitment towards 100% renewable ground transportation. Again, another first, and it parallels the grid 100%, so that we can get some synergy between the transportation as well as the grid goals. And then most recently, Mayor Caldwell and I went up to Chicago to sign the Chicago Climate Charter, which went beyond the Paris one and put some different targets out there in an array of different areas, including transit-oriented development and bike lanes, increasing the number of bike lanes and these kinds of things that can help address it from another issue, another side. And then also developing a resilient strategy, and that's really where the meat and potatoes is around the Rockefeller partnership with the city. They are helping support my particular position. They're paying for my position for 2 years. But beyond that, they offer some network and some pro bono services to the city as we tackle what they see as these over-the-horizon 21st century challenges that 100 cities across the globe are tackling at the same time. I'm going to skip this one because I know I'm limited on time. So I know that the theme of today is really around a resilience frame. And so, I want to introduce you a little bit to what Rockefeller is doing and where they're doing it. These are the 100 cities that were selected by the Rockefeller Foundation around the globe, as diverse as Mumbai and Nairobi, and then 9 cities in North America, if you count Honolulu as part of North America. And we were selected in the 3rd round. So we really are in this wonderful position of being able to learn from the first 2 rounds that were selected. Rockefeller Foundation has really gotten better about the way they work with their cities and really honed their skill and their craft. And we get to benefit that by coming in on the last round and learn from this network that over the next few years, and it will be a years-long engagement, facing these challenges and learning from each other, including some islands like Puerto Rico. So San Juan has a chief resilience officer, and obviously there's a ton of lessons to be learned coming out of that, and we'll be able to tap that through the Rockefeller Network and maybe even convene something here around their lessons learned. Here's the main pillars of the benefits of being, with the Rockefeller Foundation. I talked a little bit about the support here, developing the resilience strategy, and then tapping some pro bono services. This is where we're at in the trajectory. Right now, we're going out and talking to communities and basically soliciting input from grassroots folks around where they think vulnerabilities are on island, what they believe are the resilience issues that we should be targeting in a resilience strategy, so that we're meeting people where they're at, as opposed to where we think we are from inside the halls of government. Chip did a great job talking about some of these. I assume he had that slide as well, but it really shows you it's not a matter of if, but when for resilience issues. And this is what resilience is. I don't think it was defined earlier, but it's really this idea that if we are to survive in a century of sort of unpredictability, the more nimble we are, the more that we can survive, adapt, and grow when shocks and stresses hit us, and sort of pivot in real time and be flexible and adaptable. That is going to be what's the hallmark. I mean, you think about how evolution works. It's not the strongest necessarily that survive. It's not the smartest that survive. It's the folks who can adapt and change and pivot and grow with different situations. And that's what we need to do and create that nimbleness within our community on Oahu and throughout the counties as well. And that's what we're trying to work on, is how do we navigate, not only climate change, but, globalism of the economy, technological change, all of these things which are actually changing the very foundation and framework that we've built our institutions around for the last 100 years. And the idea is this: if we are going to encounter shocks and stresses, this is absolutely a known, it's a given. But how we have planned ahead of time to recover can send us on this trajectory where we actually build back stronger, we build back more nimble, we build back in a more adaptive way for the next challenge that comes, or do we get thrown off of our balance and rocker and start to go down? Because as Chair Case mentioned, when you're sick already and you get in a crash or an accident, that tends to build on itself. And so, think of this as sort of Detroit maybe after the 70s and the economic challenges there. Think of this this maybe as New York after Sandy and the really aggressive work they did around taking entire neighborhoods and basically doing buyouts to get them out of that area, thinking about the big U to try to prevent coastal surge in future storm events. And then this is one that we like to show folks because I know we have this ridiculously long office title, but having resiliency and sustainability in the same office is a bit of a challenge because they're not exactly the same thing, and sometimes they can actually be counter to each other. And I think one of the good examples of this is redundancy, right? In a perfectly sustainable system, you would just want one input or one import link, and it would be just-in-time delivery. But in a resilient system, you want multiple. And so if one of them goes down, there are more. But what we want to do is stay up in this right-hand part where we're both sustainable and resilient and move towards that. I'm going to skip through this and just say, going forward, we're going to work internally to try to transform our fleet by 2035, as the mayor's committed to 100% renewable, work on energy efficiency projects like the LED streetlight project that just went in, or that's just started, and making sure that we update our codes quicker and on a more reliable basis. And that's not just for efficiency's sake, that's for resiliency's sake. Our building codes are about 10 years out of date. And so I'll leave it at that. I think I'm out of time. Mahalo.
Thank you, Josh Danville. Getting short on time, so let's go to, this is something I've been meaning to say for a while. Let's go to Ron Whitmore. Ron, where are you? Okay, go for it.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Sharon and the Policy Forum, and Leo and the Office of Planning for hosting this forum. Thanks also to all the other panelists we heard from today. It's a fantastic, quick overview of the challenges we face and the opportunities before us and what we're doing to take advantage of those. Very quickly, Josh mentioned that all the other counties have sustainability offices in place, and that's not exactly true. It looks a little different in each county, and in Hawaii County, for the time being, sustainability leadership is coming out of the Department of Research and Development. It's a bit of a unique department. We inform policymaking and programming with good data and research and basically help the rest of the county operate in a sustainable way, working across agencies on big issues like sustainability, like resilience. We house the energy program and several economic development programs as well. Just as an aside, I spent 9 years of my professional life as a long-range planner for that county, and so that helps me tremendously in this work because I understand both that planning perspective and that planning side and how that relates to the adaptation element of climate planning. And then from the R&D side, looking at the energy and greenhouse gas mitigation side. Very quickly, just going to touch on 3 main points today. One is that moving forward, we definitely need to maintain some level of balance. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. In Hawaii County, what we're doing for starters is working through existing systems that are in place. We have a whole toolbox full of tools that we can currently use, primarily on the greenhouse gas mitigation side. And then I'll say a few words about what we need moving forward, partnerships, more research and analysis, and strong legislative leadership, both in terms of policy and funding and financing. Quickly, if you're not familiar with Hawaii Island, we are probably the least vulnerable from a sea level rise perspective. That's not to say, however, that we don't face challenges. These are just a couple visuals of that. One of our major population centers, Hilo in particular, is vulnerable to sea level rise in a significant way, particularly some of our lower income communities. And also, just so you put things into perspective, it's important to remember that just a single district on our island, the Puna district, you could fit the entire island of Oahu into that district. We are a very large island, very low population density, and that population is one of the most vulnerable in the state. We have highest poverty rates, lowest median incomes, and some of the highest socioeconomic needs. And so when we think about sustainability and resilience, we of course recognize the need to play our part in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly need to plan and adapt for the coming change. But we need to do that in a way that is equitable, that also focuses on the very real costs associated with doing some of this, who pays and how they pay, and what impact in particular it has on some of our most vulnerable populations. I like this graphic. This was done by DNV-GL as part of a collaborative effort the 4 counties did back in late November, early December. They helped us think through these coming planning processes we're going through on both the mitigation and adaptation side. And they overlaid mitigation tools with adaptation tools and identified that common ground where there's a lot of co-benefits. And some of what Josh just showed some of those as well. I threw in there equity, because I think it's important, that, particularly for Hawaii County, that we need to think about co-benefits not just in terms of climate planning and adaptation and mitigation planning, but also impacts that has on in a very real way in people's everyday lives. Just give you a sense of what we're going to be doing on the greenhouse gas mitigation side. A lot of it is a lot of what we've already been doing. Thanks to our very effective energy program, we are leading the state in renewable energy on a percentage basis. So we're going to continue to lead. We started this work way back in 2008, working now from an energy roadmap developed in 2012. We've made investments as a county in our own public facilities, which is, I believe, Silver LEED. It produces, it stores, and obviously uses power. And then we also have converted all of our street lights to LEDs, saving tremendous amounts of money for the county, and also have our own wind generating system to pump water. And so we'll do more of that and continue to innovate and lead across the state on that greenhouse gas mitigation side. In terms of working through existing systems, we are going to focus there initially, particularly on both the mitigation and adaptation side. We mentioned continue the energy innovations. We're in the process of adopting the energy code to maximize efficiencies, both public and private. We're about to start working closely with Hawaii Energy and our own finance department on making sure through our procurement process we're maximizing life cycle costs and the rebates available to maximize efficiency and save the county money. Collaborating with the counties, as has been mentioned several times already, on fleet management, transportation issues. I could basically say we're doing everything Kauai is doing related to our comprehensive plan, which we're also in the middle of, a little bit behind Kauai, but in a very similar way as they're doing there. Using our general plan, which is largely basically a sustainability plan for the county, to basically establish the critical policy and lay the additional planning framework for moving ahead on particularly adaptation planning. Also working on complete streets programs, revamping, rebuilding our mass transit system. And then importantly, I think it was mentioned earlier, on the capital budgeting side, this is an annual thing that we do. We're going to begin working into our capital budgeting prioritizations system consideration of climate adaptation and hopefully mitigation as well. And then coming up in 2020, we have to redo our hazard mitigation plans. We're looking to the state to, as they have in the past, fund that planning effort. And as part of that as well, absolutely include very explicitly adaptation strategies. And then quickly, just to give you an example, this is a nice graphic from Seattle. This is just another example of how to work through existing systems. There's a lot of plans and programs in place. We want to start with what we have rather than taking the time, effort, and money to build new systems and strategies. This was shown earlier, I think, at the Kauai slide in a pie graph, but it's I kind of like this way of showing it, is if we're going to move towards, climate neutrality, we need to be very clear about where the biggest chunks of that are, and Mike's slide showed that very nicely. But again, it's electric transportation and energy electrification. This is just a graphic showing we have multiple permitting systems in place through which we can already do much to both mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and begin to adapt, whether it's the flood or drainage codes, the building code on the efficiency side, or the land use code and the SMA permitting systems through which we can gradually keep structures out of vulnerable zones. Did want to say very quickly in terms of what we could use for help. We have fantastic resources already. Please continue to fund SOEST and PIXI and make the Climate Commission really an effective, leaderful commission. The report we just got was fantastic in terms of including very specific recommendations. I fully support what Chip said earlier about let's take that and run with it. And this you can't read, but I like it because it's a product of a network that the 4 counties are part of, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And they've done a fantastic job, as I think it was Representative Lee mentioned earlier, of identifying very clearly the funding and financing mechanisms that are available to local governments, state governments. We need to use every one of these that we can, and it involves getting creative about not just how we use existing public resources, but partnering where appropriate and in responsible ways with our private partners to tap private capital that is increasingly available to support climate planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron Whitmore. Questions, anybody? There's a question, Chip Fletcher.
Ron, your island has actually had 2 hurricanes or fragments of hurricanes make landfall in the last couple of years.
Have you guys responded to, how have you responded to that? Are you implementing any changes in recognition that there are going to be more hurricanes in the future?
Don't think so. Thanks. I guess it was. Yes and no. We know, what I guess I could say affirmatively is that we know that we need to be what I'd call rebuild ready. And I think we're seeing it now in Puerto Rico. I think we want to be in a place, and hopefully do this primarily through our update to our hazard mitigation plan, is hopefully have the plans in place so that when we get hit, we know how we want to rebuild, how we want to rebuild decentralized, interdependent energy systems as opposed to a dependent island-wide system. How we want to resettle people, I think, as was mentioned earlier, and not allow ourselves to rebuild in places we know are very vulnerable. So we definitely want to move in that direction, but we have a bit of a ways to go.
Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. I want to ask about the urgency given the current administration in Washington, D.C., and how that impacts what you're doing, and the opportunities that come out of the crisis from decreasing federal support, the erasure of the words climate change from the federal nomenclature. So can you talk a little bit about how the scene in DC, which is pretty much an earthquake, is impacting you at the county level in terms of what you're doing?
I can quickly say it's an unmitigated disaster, but with a small silver lining. I just saw that actually Trump made some comments about, maybe we'll rejoin the Paris Agreement in a meeting earlier today. And I actually think that we have experienced a lot of attention and growth at the subnational level because of pulling out. I don't know that many people knew what the Paris Agreement was before June 1st this year. And so I honestly believe that we're making a lot of headway as the pariah in the international community right now on the ground, because this is where the rubber meets the road. It's at counties where fleets are designed and built and procured. It's at states where, those road standards and everything happen. And so I think it's actually been a spark in some ways. Now, obviously, this is a spark that will turn into an inferno, and it's not going to be good in the long run. But I think for the near term, we're actually building some muscle and some capacity that we didn't have. We just assumed that the feds would take care of this for us. And so, while clearly we need more funding from the federal government, we need the policies. Mayor Caldwell will be sending in a letter about the Clean Power Plan and preserving that to the EPA next week. There's 60 mayors and counting that have signed that. So we want to preserve and protect those things. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it has spurred folks to action that would not have been in this fight.
Okay, thanks. We're out of time. Let's give our county leaders, the county panel, a big round of applause for joining us and sharing what they've been doing for sustainability and resilience. Keep up the great work. Okay, and now, the pièce de résistance. Colin Moore. We've asked the director of the university's Public Policy Center, Professor Colin Moore, to give us his takeaway and his advice on good plans and good public policy that will lead to effective action. Colin, it's up to you.
All right. Thanks, Jay. It is now 4 o'clock, so I'm out of time already. What I'm going to do is make this a very abbreviated presentation and just sort of leave you with the things that I think might be most relevant to those of you who work in this field. What I did want to do for a second is reflect on Hawaii's many plans of the past and why they may or may not have worked. This is one of my favorites. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I always used to love to look at those 60s futuristic drawings of what the future would look like. And of course, it never quite happened, although this actually was a HECO advertisement from 1946. It was, it was surprisingly accurate. And many of you are familiar with Hawaii's past plans. In 1970, the kind of utopian Hawaii 2000. They all have these clever taglines, somebody better care about tomorrow. This was a very utopian idea. They actually did predict some things that came to pass, like cell phones. But in many ways, when you go back and read the plan, it sort of seems hopelessly naive, in a good way. But maybe not a very effective plan because we certainly didn't follow this. In 2008, a lot of you worked on this Hawaii 2050, building a shared future. We think of plans, of course, not necessarily because they always come to pass, but because they do give us some direction. And I think a lot of people think of, the classic plan of Chicago. If you think about a plan that actually worked, if you've been to Chicago, this was a plan for Daniel Burnham, and it more or less came to pass. So I was going to talk more about how I thought planning could be effective, but because we're out of time, I'm not going to do that. What I really want to do is just leave you with this, which is that any good plan, if we're talking about a sustainability plan, really has to be about politics. We have to recognize the political opportunities and the risks. And planning and many of you work for the state, this really does involve a lot of public trust. And so what I wanted to just leave you with is this brand new pilot survey that my center and Sharon Center did to poll the Hawaii public. We actually know extraordinarily little in this state about what people think about politics. We've done very little polling. And so this is the national average, not so surprisingly, right? 1958 to 2015. Do you think the federal government is right just about always or most of the time? The results are pretty grim, right? It used to be, really quite remarkably positive in the early 60s. Now it's about 19%. But my question for you is, do you think we do better or worse than this federal survey for the federal government? We're worse. And actually, this is remarkable because usually state and local governments poll better for most states than the federal government. We poll worse. So it's 17% here in Hawaii. That's 2 percentage points lower than the federal level. We asked them, do you think the state government's run by a few big interests or run for the benefit of all people? We're a remarkably cynical group here. People really do think the state is run by a few big interests. What's that? Well, they may very well be right. Maybe more discouraging for those of you in state government, we asked them, do you think the government usually wastes taxpayer money sometimes or doesn't? People think you're wasting a lot of their money. And that means it's very difficult for them to trust things like these planning processes. I don't know the solution, how to get around this, but building more trust has got to be a big part of it. And the last thing, we did ask some energy questions, and I'll just close by leaving you with this one, because I think it does reflect some opportunities, but also some risks. I don't know how well you can read this, but the first one is to support higher taxes on fossil fuels to pay for renewable and energy-efficient projects and programs. People aren't so thrilled about anything involving increasing their taxes or their fuel costs. Probably no surprise to any of you here. They do seem a little more open to public transportation. Now, whether or not people would actually ride the bus or take advantage of these public transportation options remains to be seen. But those are maybe the opportunities. No one wants to pay more money at the end of the day, and no one really trusts the government to plan. That's sort of a rather sad conclusion to reach at the end of this conference. But I think when we think about planning for the future, we have to incorporate politics. We have to think about how people trust government and why they may not trust the planning process. I think we can probably do better, but that's, in this short conclusion, that's what I wanted to leave you with. Maybe just a reality check. So thanks. Sure. That's an excellent question, and I don't really know the answer to it. I wish I did. I mean, not necessarily these public participation events. Those don't really seem to do a whole lot. So the truth is, this is the great question in American political science, and no one has a convincing answer. I mean, it is so hard to build trust with lots.
Put it in your next survey. Ask them. Ask Annie.
What do we pay to build more trust? Actually, that's a good question. Okay, we'll do that.
I like that. Thanks. Yeah. Similar question. Did you ask about people's trust in county government? Yes.
We didn't. We should, and maybe we'll do it next time. I suspect probably that there is more trust for county government. That's usually how it works. The lower the level of government, the higher the trust. But what would really be interesting is to look at the variation among the counties. Usually folks on Oahu tend to be a bit more cynical. But I mean, it's an empirical question, so that's another one we really should ask when we do this again.
Could you ask if city managers are better than political candidates?
We could. I mean, the public actually, when you poll them, tends to like, kind of technocratic management, not to trust politicians very much, which is sort of weird because they have a lot more power to fire politicians than they do bureaucrats. But I mean, much like when you ask what branch of government you like the most, people love the Supreme Court, even though they have very little input to who's selected or the decisions that are made. So there is a sort of anti-democratic bias in the way people perceive government.
Now, to your point about politicians versus bureaucrats, you ought to overlay a graph that shows how the state and counties have grown in their bureaucracy. Over top of that, trustees, and see if it's inverted. Or the more bureaucrats you have, the less trust there is in government.
That's a good question. So I mean, I know that's not true for the federal level. We have much, much lower civilian federal employment than we did when trust was much higher. But the people perceive that it's higher than it really is, and that does contribute to trust in government, I think, yeah.
Government's based on elections.
Yeah.
But public officials, civil servants aren't elected. They're hired against the HR process.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Did you check to see if the decline in trust correlates with campaign finance?
Sorry. Could you say that again?
Did you check to see if the decline in trust correlates with campaign finance?
Oh, the rise of money spent. We didn't check that for Hawaii. Nationally, people are much more, think that there's much more corruption than there actually really is. The voters are incredibly cynical. I mean, they think that old votes for dollars stuff, like politicians taking money out of briefcases, that actually happens pretty frequently. So that does, but a lot of this is about perception more than reality.
Final question. What percentage of people does an elected official represent? Like, how many people vote at the federal, state, county level?
So fewer people vote at lower levels of government. So there's the least participation when you're talking about county elections and local elections. What's that?
What's the range?
I mean, it depends. I mean, in a state like Hawaii, when you're talking about like the number of eligible voters who, if in a one-party state where the only thing that really matters is the Democratic Party, I mean, you're talking about like 15% of the people actually making a difference, really deciding who wins these elections. Yeah, it's a very small number of people. I always joke to my students that if you want to get elected to the legislature, you make 500 friends and you'd have a pretty good shot at it.
Colin, just one other thing is there are people, there are legislators listening to us on the remote system here in the Capitol building. And
I'm not always the most popular person in this building.
No, you're fine. You're very popular with us, Colin. Anyway, question is, what's your advice to them about rebuilding trust? These are elected officials. What should they do if they want to take your advice?
Part of it is not running against the government. I mean, a lot of people sense that the government is ineffective and it can't do anything. I mean, in some ways, we're the victim of our own attempts at transparency. It's very easy to write stories about government failures, much easier than the private sector. And people understandably believe this. They believe that the government fails more than the private sector. They believe that politicians are corrupt, when it's really not true. Not true comparatively. So how do you build trust? I mean, I think our politicians work really hard at it. They know tons of people in their district, and people like their individual members. That's the tough thing. They like their representative, but the legislature, that body of unknown individuals, they hate. It's really a difficult thing to turn around. I don't know if there's a clear answer for what they can do. I mean, I wish I did, but it's only gotten worse, and it, with the current administration, probably will continue to get worse.
Well, that's consistent with all the other encouragement we've had today. Thank you, Colin. Great. You're definitely a high point. Worth waiting for, absolutely. Well, let me do thanks. Mahalo to all the presenters who spoke today and those who engaged in the Q&A, to those who planned the program, including our intrepid staff and graduate students, Michelle, Erin, Poya, and Crystal, and to Glenn Booth of Capital TV and Ian Davidson of Think Tech Hawaii Filming. And thanks to all of you for joining us today on this 14th annual legislative briefing here with the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. Happy New Year. And let's make 2018 really special somehow. As they say, every day better. Aloha. See you next time.